Marked by Kate Rudolph. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel for more audiobooks. Marked copyright Kate Rudolph 2016. Chapter 1. Gold gripped the handle of the passenger side door of the car and tried to look nonchalant. Her 15-year-old sister, Lily, was driving. At just after 9 at night, this downtrodden district was nearly abandoned, but Gold remembered her sister learning to walk. And to bike. There'd been plenty of spills then. She was only waiting for the car crash to finish the trifecta. Stop freaking out, Lily told her, knuckles white against the black leather steering wheel. You're making me nervous. I'm not freaking out, Gold said through clenched teeth. Pay attention to the road. Lily heaved a sigh that only a teenager could heave. But she kept her eyes on the street ahead of them. You know I'm supposed to be at Crystal's birthday party, right? She has a chocolate fountain. I can't believe you're making me miss it for one stupid ghoul. That was enough for Gold to let go of the door handle. Instead, she pinched the bridge of her nose while Lily kept talking about how amazing Crystal's party was supposed to be. At 25, Gold had missed out on her fair share of friends' birthdays, graduations, weddings, and even, scarily enough, baby showers. It was probably why she could now count the number of friends she had on one hand, with a few fingers to spare. But Lily kept talking. It's just one ghoul, why can't you take care of it? She glanced over, eyes wide and hopeful, as if Gold would instruct her to turn the car around at once and let her go to her friend's party. When that didn't happen, Lily's shoulders sagged and she turned back to looking at the road. I just don't see why we need two huntresses for this. Because it's just a ghoul. This is the perfect hunt for a beginner, Gold explained. I was chasing deer and bobcats for a year when I was 15. We couldn't find an undead mouse, let alone a person. Slaying evil was their family duty and curse. Gold had been introduced to the world of undead things when she was just 4 years old. A roving zombie killed their dog while it was playing in the backyard. Her grandmother had taken care of the undead, but Gold suffered nightmares for weeks after. She hadn't understood what she was then. But a few years later, the family sat her down and laid it all out for her. The Joneses had been tasked with cleansing the world of the undead scourge. It was a duty going back generations, long before the first European made his way to America. They were gifted with the ability to sense their prey and use their reflexes to fight them. But they were still only human. How is that a good thing? Don't we want there to be no undead? Lily was still in the early stages of understanding her place in the grand scheme of things. It's why we moved. Kenzie, Virginia had been a nice town, but too small for the Joneses. Once the undead figure out where we live, they stay away. But they just keep on coming to Jasperton. Even after nearly 10 years, the undead flowed into town in a steady stream. It was probably the proximity to Chicago that kept them close. Wahoo, Lily said, her tone deadpan. Like most teenagers, she was not happy to be charged with a heavy destiny. They passed the last stoplight in Jasperton and the road opened before them. The street was dotted with dilapidated buildings, most abandoned for more than a decade, the only residents rats and squatters. Stop the car, Gold said. Lily slammed on the brakes and Gold flew forward, the seat belt cutting into her neck. She cleared her throat and readjusted herself before pointing to a weed-strewn parking lot in front of a burnt-out strip mall. Park over there. Lily did so without argument, suddenly serious. Once she turned the headlights off, the street was cast in darkness, only the tiny sliver of moon giving them light. Now close your eyes and concentrate. Lily let her hands drop from the steering wheel as her eyelids drifted shut. She breathed in and out, long and slow. Focus on the ghoul, said Gold, trying to guide the meditation. It was a difficult trick to learn, but once a huntress got it, the undead were easy to spot. Gold had locked onto the ghoul a mile from their house. Even now, she could sense it close to them. It's west of us, said Lily, her brows scrunched in thought. About a mile away. Are you sure? That wasn't right. The ghoul was much closer than that and Gold wasn't going to mentally let go of it until they had it in their sights. Focus on the ghoul, she instructed. Lily had probably latched onto another, possibly stronger undead. Gold would check it out later, when her sister wasn't there to get in the way or get hurt. Lily wasn't ready to handle a vampire yet. If that was what it was. Lily shook her head, tone tinged with frustration. No, now it's north. Maybe 2 streets over? Good. That was what she wanted to hear. There was an abandoned house on Weiler Street that would make the perfect hiding place for an undead. Gold would bet $20 that it was hunkered down there. They got out of the car and opened the trunk. Hidden in the wheel well was an arsenal that would have made a militiaman proud. Gold pulled out a handgun and handed it over to her sister, along with a huge machete still in a spine sheath and a road flare. Lily held the weapons but didn't suit up, waiting to hand them back over to Gold. But Gold unlatched a hidden compartment to reveal a rifle case. She took the case and slung it over her shoulder. I thought we weren't supposed to use that, said Lily. Gold patted the case. This is for security. She looked at her sister's weapons. Suit up. It's one ghoul. You can handle it. She'd already discussed it with their mom before she'd left town for the month, and now Gold was doing her best to seem confident. Lily needed to learn. Simple enough to extinguish. If you get into trouble, scream for help or light the flare. Then run for your life, 'cause I'll take it out. Wait, what? Lily slid the sheath on and stuck the flare in a holder on her belt. The gun she kept out. Ghouls were normally slow, but they could rush when the feed was on them and she wouldn't have time to draw the pistol. You can handle this, Lil. I believe in you. Still, Gold gave her a tight hug before sending her on her way. She didn't know how their mom did it. Gold set herself up on the roof of an old shop. The stairs inside were half rotten and she needed to climb onto the roof from a window, but hers was the safer job tonight. Once she was set up, she flashed a laser pointer in Lily's direction, giving her the green light. Then she said a little prayer. Please, Lord, keep her safe. She settled in to watch through the rifle's scope. The ghoul had hidden itself in the first floor of the small house. There was a huge window that let Gold see the entire scene. Lily walked up the driveway and around the back of the house. The ghoul shambled about in the living room. Gold trained her sight on it, ready to take it out if Lily got into danger. Then the ghoul jerked and Gold was sure that it was because Lily had opened the back door. Blood. The scent wafted over, choking her and making her eyes water. Gold could feel it pouring down her throat, drowning her. Invigorating her. Making her strong. A vampire. 1 mile north. Just as Lily had sensed. Gold cut off her senses, shuddering that latent psychic ability. She could not abandon her sister for that hunt, but she would find him later. A vampire that strong enough to send out a psychic attack to an unknown hunter, could tear through the city in a matter of days. She couldn't let him do that. Why was she so sure he was him? A scream broke off Gold's thought. She trained her gaze back on the house in front of her. The flare lit, momentarily blinding her. She looked away, blinking madly, hoping that Lily had done as instructed and run like hell. She gave herself 2 more seconds, then she turned back to the scene. The ghoul had picked up the flare, but Lily was nowhere in sight. Good. Gold rested her finger on the trigger and then pulled with only the slightest force. The gun kicked back, butting into her shoulder. She'd have a bruise in the morning, but it didn't matter. 2 more shots and the ghoul went down, the flare falling on top of him and lighting him up like kindling. With the speed of 1,000 huntresses, Gold disassembled the gun and put it back in its case. She slung it over her shoulder and ran across the roof, vaulting through the window to the stairs with the carelessness of a suicidal woman. By the time she made it outside, Lily was waiting for her, shaking, the gun still fully loaded and in her hand. A great gash ran down her arm where the ghoul's claws had slashed her. Thank God that ghouls couldn't infect humans like that. I'm so sorry, Lily cried, tears rolling down her cheeks. I fucked it up. I can't do this. Gold pulled her close and let her get it out. You're still alive and that thing is dead. That means you succeeded. It took several minutes before they could let go of each other, and Gold's eyes weren't dry when they got back to the car. Gold drove home in silence. She knew that Lily was going over everything that had happened to her, figuring out where she went wrong and how she could do better. Crystal's birthday party with its chocolate fountain was completely forgotten. And somewhere out there, moving south now and getting farther away, a vampire stalked the streets. A ghoul wouldn't be the only thing that Gold killed that night. Chapter 2. Adam Luther maneuvered the second-to-last bookshelf into his store. It was nearing 10:30 and he had been closed up for an hour. Even on Saturday night, customers didn't come to a bookshop so late. He kept it open anyway, an excuse to haunt Jasperton in the late hours of the night. He'd been here for 12 years, and the way it became a ghost town after 9 o'clock still set him on edge. For decades, Adam had bummed around the cities of Europe, drinking in the nightlife, quite literally, and living it up as only a libertine could hope to. Perhaps libertine was overstating it, but Adam knew the value of a good story. It was only in these hours alone, when everyone had gone to sleep and the monsters still hid away, that he let the mask slip. While shuttering his shop for the night, he was simply a man who had lived for far too many years, who had committed far too many sins, and only wanted his rest before he burned in hell. The weight of the years, all 343 of them, weighed heavily tonight. The moon was but a sliver in the sky and Jasperton was quiet. As one of the damned, he was consigned to these hours of darkness, cast out from the light of day. He was growing maudlin, one glass of Merlot going to his head. That was the surest sign that the need for a feed was imminent. When simple wine could affect him like this, he knew he would soon grow weaker until he was little better than the puny mortals who didn't know that they should fear him. Adam walked back outside to retrieve the last rack of books, but the sound of an SUV rumbling down the street distracted him. He wanted to tell whoever was driving it was a dangerous night to be out. There was a ghoul out there that he intended to hunt. Until it was off the streets, it would be a threat to all of the humans of Jasperton, and perhaps the greater Chicagoland area. He might have been a monster, but that didn't mean he'd let other monsters live in his city. The SUV pulled up to the traffic light outside of his bookstore, lots of lit, and stopped at the red light. Adam looked over and caught sight of the driver, who was haloed by the light from a street lamp. His breath caught. His fangs ached. In 3 centuries, he'd seen a lot of faces. After a while, they all blurred together. There were only so many ways that eyes, a nose, and a mouth could be arranged. But once in a blue moon, no, once in 10 blue moons, there was a new face, shocking in its novelty. The woman driving the car had one. Her blonde hair was held back, a tight braid falling over one shoulder. She looked toward him and the first thing he saw were her lips, full and shining. Her eyes were cornflower blue, and her nose gave her that regal profile that belonged on a coin. A small scar cut across the top of one of her cheeks, a beauty mark sealed in pain. Lord above! If Adam were human for one night, he'd lie her down and take her until the sun burned him to ashes at dawn. She would be worth it. Her lips opened in a silent "oh" and her eyes narrowed. She looked him over and Adam felt like there was a piece he was missing. The knowledge in her eyes was painful, enough to bring a grown man to his knees, though she couldn't have been more than 30. His store was on the corner and only 10 feet separated him from her car, but the light changed and she drove on, and a unique, beautiful face disappeared down the lonely street. Adam shook his head. The madness of his thirst nipped at his heels. If he didn't get it under control, it wouldn't be a night of imagined bed sport with a girl. It would be bloodshed and pain. Hunger rippled through his veins as he recalled the sweet taste of hot blood pooling around his fangs and pouring down his throat. Feed first. Hunt later. Ghouls were easy prey, but he couldn't risk a hunt when he was compromised by bloodlust. He quickly put away the bookshelf and turned off the lights to the store, locking it behind him. Jennifer, the head clerk, would need to deal with the books in the morning. Right now he couldn't concentrate. He took off down the street, headed toward Hansel Lane, which housed the 2 rowdiest bars in town. But before he even made it a block, he spotted the black SUV parked in a lot outside of a closed restaurant. His beautiful girl was out for a stroll. She'd make delicious company. Chapter 3. When hunting unknown vampires, it was unwise to dive in head first. They were stronger than huntresses, faster and meaner, and had decades, sometimes centuries, more experience than even the best human had to offer. Fighting a vampire without first researching its identity was worse than fighting blind. It was fighting blind, bleeding, and with one arm chopped off. But Gold couldn't just ignore the vampire on the corner. She had a duty to her people and her town. She had to keep Jasperton safe, even at the cost of her own life. She was no fool. And she wasn't ready to fight. But that didn't mean she was going to leave him alone tonight. She parked her SUV in a parking lot downtown and took off for Hydale Park. It was open to the road, brightly lit, and technically closed. With the Hydale Chapel on the other side, it was the perfect place to meet a monster. Though she grudgingly admitted that he didn't look like a monster. It was a toss-up with vamps. Ghouls and zombies at least had the decency to look like the shambling undead, skin sagging and sloughing off, the stench of rot thick around them. Vampires didn't rot. Some of them were a bit pale, but they never really looked dead. Of the handful of vamps that Gold had ever seen in person, only half had looked monstrous, their fangs grown out beyond their lips, eyes wild and red, fingernails twisted and hardened into wickedly sharp claws. Those monsters were damned hard to kill. And one had taken her aunt down with him, right in front of Gold when she was 18. Too young to fight on her own, but too old to be kept away from a hunt. She'd been the one to plant the stake in that monster's heart as the blood gushing from Aunt Eileen's innards distracted him. Bile rose in her throat as she remembered that night 7 years ago. Gold took a deep breath and tamped it down. Distraction got a girl killed. But no, the vampire on the corner hadn't been one of the monstrous ones. He'd been the most beautiful man that she'd ever seen in person. His muscles rippled under the light white shirt he wore as he lifted up that bookcase by himself. It was certainly too heavy for a human to lift. If it had been daylight, someone would have noticed. But if it had been daylight, the vampire would not have been out. His hair was long and held back at the nape of his neck like some colonial soldier. And the scruff on his chin only enhanced the rest of his features. It was that iffy color between brown and blonde, or at least appeared so under the light from the store. If he was human, she might have had dreams about the feel of his lips against her skin. She might have imagined his impossibly dark, sinful eyes looming over her in the night as he took her to the heights of pleasure. But she'd never think those things about a vampire. She wouldn't let herself. And even if he'd been human, she'd know to stay away. No man that sexy was ever worth it. They always let you down. Gold shook her head, a wry smile on her lips. God, she needed to get laid. Fantasizing about a vampire. What kind of madness was that? The SUV was just a breadcrumb for the vamp to follow. Gold didn't try to hide her trail as she crossed the street to Hydale Park. She even hummed a little tune, off-key, but loud enough for any vamp in the area to hear. During the day, Hydale Park bustled with people. Young mothers and fathers played with their children at the small playground. Dogs and their owners ran around the wide green meadow, fenced in to prevent runaways. Runners ran, joggers jogged, walkers walked, and you couldn't go more than 3 minutes without saying hello to someone. After dark, it was a different story. While they kept the lights on for safety and visibility, the park was closed and cops walked by every hour to make sure it stayed empty. A wrought iron gate blocked the entrance from the main sidewalk, but the lock had been broken for years. Gold pulled on the gate entrance and left it open behind her, another breadcrumb for her stalker. She opened up her senses and picked up his trail. He was a block behind her and quickly heading toward the park. But something was off. The signature she'd felt while hunting the ghoul had been slimy and grating, like broken glass dragged across her skin. The vampire behind her was as blood-soaked as any she'd ever sensed, but there was no slime. He wasn't the same vampire she'd sensed earlier. 2 vamps near Jasperton. She needed to alert her family immediately. But the beautiful vampire slid into the park behind her, giving Gold only 2 options. Face him, or run away. The chapel at the other end of the park would offer sanctuary. The combined force of the parishioners' belief made it safe from evil creatures. But she might be stuck until sunrise. Face the vampire then, and get out of the situation as quickly as possible. Isn't it a little late to be wandering around the park? He asked, walking under the light closest to her. He looked dangerous, but not the kind of dangerous that would hurt her. Not physically, anyway. I think I can handle myself. Now that there were only a few feet between them, Gold got a better look at him. The bastard was just as handsome as he'd been several minutes ago, and now she saw that he was at least 6 feet tall. She was weak for tall men. But not this one. Not a vampire. He spread out his hands, offering a little bow. By all means. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. He held himself loosely, ready to pounce on her if she took off, but trying to disguise his coiled strength. If he was looking for it, he'd see her in a similar fighter's stance, but few men ever noticed when a woman was moments from violence. She needed to figure out who he was. The Huntress database listed 53 active vampires in the U.S. Vampires were incredibly powerful, but thankfully rare, and since they possessed human intelligence, they were much more difficult to take out than the ghouls and zombies that popped up. Since he was a man, she knocked out 15 of the names from the list. That still left 37. Accounting for race, there were still too many options. Then why did you follow me? If she kept him talking, she might learn enough. And if she kept him interested, he might just let her live. The vampire shrugged, the motion practiced. He wore sin like a cloak, his every movement calculated to show him in the most seductive light. You looked interesting. He had the slightest hint of an accent, his R's a little too thick. English, perhaps, but not for a long time. Do you often follow interesting women at midnight? If he'd been human, she would be creeped out. But the threat he posed heated her blood, excitement sizzling in her veins. She never felt more alive than in these pre-fight moments, where her death could be dealt in seconds. It was the curse of her destiny. Oh, he drawled, taking a lazy step toward her. I wouldn't say it's the middle of the night. His cologne was woodsy and intoxicating. Gold smiled, she couldn't help it. While doing so, she reached into her pocket and grabbed the most dangerous weapon she possessed. Her cell phone. She swiped the screen open and pointed it at him. It's 10:57, that's close enough. He waved his hand, making a dismissive sound. Not nearly midnight. The night is still young. Gold crossed her arms and leaned back, keeping her phone close. So, do you have a name? Adam. He offered it with a smile and a glint of white teeth. And what about you? Adam Luther. The scourge of the Somme. Ice chilled her spine and any forbidden desire went up in smoke. 100 years before, he'd torn through Europe, killing soldiers on both sides of the war and wreaking general havoc. The earliest sighting of him was more than 300 years earlier, making him one of the oldest known vampires in existence. And no vampire lived that long without learning to wield cruelty and violence like a finely honed blade. There was no such thing as a good vampire. Especially not a good old vampire. She was in more danger than she could have imagined. How had he come to town and no one sensed it? He'd been working at a bookstore, for God's sake. How long had he been in Jasperton? Even standing right in front of her, he was hard to sense without her trying. She could feel the vampiric presence pressing against her psyche, but if she didn't focus on it, it faded into white noise. Was this a skill that vampires could learn? Her heart was pounding too hard. She knew it in the split second when his nostrils flared. In half a blink, Adam was beside her, one of her hands gripped in his own. She tried to struggle against him, but he was too strong. He raised her wrist to his lips and his fangs flashed. He was going to kill her. His fangs scraped against the delicate skin of her wrist, and the movement would have been almost seductive if not for the fear. With her other hand, Gold struggled with her phone, blindly unlocking it and punching at the screen. Lily was too far away to help, but that didn't mean she was defenseless. He sank his teeth, blood pooling on the surface of her skin, and sirens blared. One siren, actually. It was enough to startle him. Gold pulled her arm back and took off, sprinting toward the sanctuary. She clasped at the bite marks on her wrist, trying to staunch the blood. But her heart was pounding too fast, and something about a vampire's bite didn't let wounds close quickly. Her phone fell out of her hand, but she couldn't stop to grab it. Adam was close on her heels, and if she quit moving for an instant, he'd be upon her. She didn't look back. She could sense him, his hunger adding spice to his psychic imprint. There were less than 20 feet between them. But the chapel was just across the street, and there was no fence on this side of the park to separate it from the street. She could make it. She ran blindly, not looking for cars. A truck's horn blasted, and she felt the gust of wind as it drove by behind her. A white picket fence demarcated the chapel yard from city property. Gold vaulted over it, falling onto her back when she came down. She rolled onto her knees and sprang up. Adam had frozen on the other side of the fence. His eyes narrowed. "I thought you were interesting before, love. But this is truly surprising." He bowed to her, his hands flourishing like a courtier. Then he held up her phone. "Until we meet again, Marigold Jones." Chapter 4. Adam rolled her name around in his mind. Marigold Jones. He wouldn't have known it if not for the email notification on her lock screen. He liked the name, and the woman. A huntress in his town. He should have known, but Adam had spent the last 12 years trying to live a simple life. He didn't seek out danger or trouble, and only fought when monsters like ghouls and zombies threatened his neighbors. If there were such a thing as a vampire monk, the term might have fit, despite his well-earned reputation. He didn't linger at the Highdale Chapel. A huntress never worked alone, and there had to be a phone inside. He wouldn't wait for her friends to show up. But on the off chance that her friends were nearby and ready to follow him, Adam didn't try heading back to his house outside of town. He would not risk his security during daylight. Besides, if he wanted to get any information off the phone, he'd need a computer. At home, he only had a tablet. So he headed back to the bookshop. Marigold had already seen him there, and, while he doubted that she would hurt other humans to get to him, after tonight he couldn't risk going back. It would be his final goodbye to his second home. The walk back was short, and he let himself in through the front door. Though the lights were off, his superior vampire senses and the glow from the street lamp outside provided enough light for him to see by. When he stepped into the store, something felt off. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and his mind screamed for caution. He wasn't alone. He opened the door to the back office and flipped on the light, ready to fight or to flee depending on what he found. Instead, he was shocked still. A ghost from his past stood in the middle of the room, a newspaper clutched under his arm. He was short for a modern man, though when they'd met 100 years ago, he'd been of average height, at 5'8" or so. His black hair was clipped short, and just as he'd loved to after the war, he wore red and black, the specter of violence evident in his clothing. Richard O'Connell, former friend and one of the most dangerous bastards in the world. Adam slid Marigold's cell phone into his pocket. He didn't trust O'Connell with it. The huntress was his to deal with, and he hadn't settled on how he would handle the situation yet. But O'Connell only had one solution to dealing with his adversaries, and it had been true even when he was human. Kill them all. Violently. Back then, it had been great sport, but Adam was not the same man these days. And Richard didn't know that Marigold was his enemy. Her blood coursed through Adam's veins, humming a symphony. Could an enemy make him feel like that? He'd barely drunk half a sip, but it was like taking in pure liquid energy. 1 pint from her and he'd be sated for months. No, he didn't want to kill her. But he wanted to drink deep. Almost forgotten desire surged within him. If he buried himself deep into her, would he find the pleasure that he'd been robbed of for centuries? He ached to find out. But not right now. Adam locked down those thoughts. If O'Connell found out about her, he'd want to join in. Marigold would be dead before the morning, and no one was going to hurt her, not until he was done with her. O'Connell raised an eyebrow, and Adam realized that he'd been staring at him dumbly for several seconds. "What are you doing here?" he asked. I thought you were in Sierra Leone. He wasn't afraid. O'Connell wouldn't hurt him. But that didn't mean that Adam wanted to be anywhere near the man. O'Connell laughed. He took the paper out from under his arm and dropped it down onto the desk. The entire back room was half office/half stock room, and entirely too tiny for both of their egos. Not for a decade at least. Do you realize how sunny it is in Africa? Vampires and sunlight did not mix, just as the legend said. Walking into the sun was like diving into a vat of acid and then stepping through fire. If you got out in time, you might survive, but it wouldn't be pleasant. I must have missed the postcard. Adam crossed his arms and leaned back against the small sliver of wall beside the door. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually spoken to O'Connell, and until tonight, he'd been happy to keep it that way. You always were the funny one, Luther. He took a seat at Adam's desk and leaned back, clasping his hands behind his dark hair. We can't all be as pretty as you. During the war and the years after, they'd had a rhythm. Adam could feel the siren song of old habits, but he resisted, and it wasn't even difficult. He wasn't that man anymore. You're full of shit. I like that. O'Connell turned his attention away from Adam and picked up a framed staff photo beside the computer screen. It was from a charity dinner his employees had hosted 2 years ago. Who's the redhead? She looks delicious. He knew that tone of voice. O'Connell was already fantasizing about what he could do to Kelly, a sweet girl who'd worked for him that summer. I can't remember her name, Adam lied. But she screamed beautifully as I trained her. O'Connell didn't need to know that she was still alive, it was the best way to keep her safe. And he really didn't need to know that Adam hadn't killed to feed in a very long time. Since making the choice, he'd lost power, but he'd never felt more clear-headed. Is that what this is? O'Connell asked, looking around the back room. Your own little farm? You always were clever. Some vampires did that, groomed humans and raised them as food. During the old days, Adam had disdained the lack of sport. Now he found the practice purely horrific. What are you doing here, Richard? Adam demanded. He wasn't going to waste the night speaking to a man he hoped to never see again. Can a man not drop in on his oldest friend? O'Connell looked legitimately hurt. Adam wondered what kind of world a man had to be living in where he could think that the two of them were still friends. What is the country coming to? O'Connell reached over and flipped open the newspaper, the spread covering all of the documents on the desk, along with the computer keyboard. Anyway, I wanted to let you know I was in the city. The actual city, of course, not this little place. He was referring to Chicago. Drop in if you're ready for a bit of sport. He placed a red and black business card on top of the newspaper. By the way, you'll need to fix the lock on your back door. Some miscreant broke it. Without waiting for Adam to pick up the card or read the paper, he took off. Adam waited until he heard the back door bang shut before he placed the business card to the side and picked up the paper. It was obvious what article he was supposed to read. A smiling picture of a young blonde girl sat next to a picture of a beach with police tape set up around the parking lot. The body of Hannah Behrens, 19, of Kankakee, washed up onto Loyola Beach. Police speculate this was an accident. Ms. Behrens was a student at Northwestern. Her body was mutilated. Ship's rudder. Terrible tragedy. It went on, but Adam got the picture. O'Connell had just declared that Chicago was his. Adam doubted that Ms. Behrens was O'Connell's first victim, and the fact that she'd washed up on the shore meant he was still making some effort to disguise his kills. If the corpse was so badly mutilated that the police thought she'd been killed by a ship, it meant that O'Connell's cruelty and ferocity had increased 100-fold. Was it the blood madness? In the olden days, it had nipped at Adam's heels, the seductive call begging for death and destruction. Those that surrendered to it lost all semblance of their humanity. They transformed into beasts, growing out claws and fangs as big as a jungle cat's. Adam hadn't tangled with that beast since he stopped killing, but he could remember the darkest days when he almost gave himself over. O'Connell hadn't completely surrendered to it, not yet. If he had, He would have never been able to come and speak to Adam. Was it a cry for help? A final plea before the darkness took hold? Or was it, as he said, an invitation to the revelry? Adam took a seat and rested his head in his hand. He was old and tired. A small but growing part of him longed to see the sun one final time. And now he had to face a maddening vampire and a huntress who tasted like daylight and power. He pulled out Marigold's phone and hit the home button. Account deactivated. He sighed and tossed it onto the counter. His talk with O'Connell had taken too long, and she'd bricked it, either using a computer at the chapel or calling one of her friends to do the job. Adam cursed. All he had was her name. But he was going to find Marigold Jones. After all, he knew of a dangerous vampire that she might be interested in learning about. They both had to keep their city safe. Chapter 5. At 5 a.m., Gold decided to risk going home. She was going crazy cooped up in the chapel. She couldn't sleep, not only because Adam Luther might come back and set the place on fire, but also because there could be a security guard doing rounds at any minute. To treat the bite wound, she'd fashioned a bandage out of hand towels and tape, but it took more than an hour for the bleeding to stop. Damn vampires. After a frantic call home to get Lily to log in and brick her phone, she was left pacing, boredom and exhaustion warring for dominant focus. Hours and hours passed and there was no sign of Adam Luther or church security. The clock struck 5 and the sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, but it was probably safe to move. Vampires didn't risk the light of day, finding their resting places long before the first rays of sunlight illuminated the earth. But every step she took down the road back to her car was a cautious one. No one was out. Jasperton was a ghost town so early and would be for at least another hour. She made it back to her car and gave it a quick once-over. It didn't look like Luther had tampered with it. Satisfied, she started it up and drove off. It was a struggle to keep her eyes on the road. It felt like there were 10-pound weights attached to each of her eyelids. If she didn't get a few hours of sleep soon, she wouldn't be able to function come nightfall. But the drive wasn't long and she made it home in one piece. The Jones residence might be called a mansion by some, but they used every inch too of space. Gold, Lily, her mom, 2 aunts, her cousin Charlie, and occasionally her grandmother all called the place home. The house wasn't in Jasperton proper, but was about 3 miles out and into the country. It sat on 10 acres of farmland that had been taken over by forest. They kept the acre around the house clear, but didn't tend to the rest of it, letting nature take its course. On the other side of their property, farms had sprung up, leaving the Jones house to feel like a magical house in the middle of the heartland. Gold lived in the most secluded room, a converted apartment over the garage. She had her own private entrance from the outside and a trap door that let her down into the garage. They'd moved when she was 18, and as the oldest of the kids, she'd claimed the room for herself. She pulled her car into the garage and shut the door behind her. She was about to go back outside to go upstairs when the door to the house opened up and Lily came running out. "Where have you been?" She threw her arms tight around Gold. "I got caught up." "Shouldn't you be asleep?" She hoped that Lily hadn't been up all night worrying. Gold had told her to sleep after they got off the phone. Lily stepped back and looked Gold up and down. Her eyes laser-focused on the makeshift bandage on Gold's wrist. "Mom would kill you if she knew you got hurt." "What was it?" Gold hadn't been completely forthcoming with her sister. She couldn't risk Lily doing something stupid. Their mom and aunts were out of town on a zombie hunt in Michigan. Gold was the only fully trained huntress in Jasperton until they came back. One huntress wasn't equipped to take on 2 vampires, but if she ignored them, people would die. If she hadn't been so tired, helplessness might have set in. Luckily, she was too exhausted for it to hit her too hard. "We'll talk after I sleep," she said. She didn't give her any more information. It would still be daylight by the time Gold woke up. She'd explain everything then. "I want to talk to both you and Charlie. Be here at 4. We'll order pizza." She gave Lily one last hug and left her in the garage. Each step up to her room felt like climbing a miniature mountain, but she made it and locked the door behind her. Gold stripped off her boots and the holster holding her stakes and a few protection charms. Then she fell face first onto the bed, falling asleep before she realized she was laying down. Gold slowly became aware of the dream, and as it settled over her, she forgot she was dreaming at all. She sat in a bedroom, ornate walls covered in gilt and thick wallpaper. It was like something out of a historical movie. She half expected King Louis to burst through the door at any moment. She looked down and saw her breasts on display, propped up with the help of a tight corset. Her skirts were in a pile around her, the dress a delicate white with blue embroidery. Gold reached forward and picked up the dainty china teacup in front of her. She brought it to her lips and sipped. But it was too hot and she hissed, her tongue burnt. Then there were hands on her hips and a man bent over, his lips brushing against her ear. "Does my lady enjoy the tea?" Adam Luther's sexy voice asked. The promise of carnal satisfaction and the slight rasp sent a shiver down her spine. She'd never called a man to service her before, to give her pleasure, but today he would do anything she asked. It is not something I've tried before. Quite a different blend. But certainly to my liking. He kissed along the ridge of her neck, his lips continuing on until they found her spine. "Then I will endeavor to make it splendid." She felt his fingers flit across the ribbons holding her bodice together. Gold bit back a moan as the dress suddenly loosened, letting her suck in deep breaths she hadn't realized that she'd been missing. Adam pulled hard, completely undoing the bindings. Her bodice gaped, revealing her naked bosom to Adam's searching hands. He kissed her neck again, nipping against the thick tendon. He did not prick her skin, his teeth blunt and human. This was wrong. She knew she should stop him, but then he used his tongue, marking her with it. Gold didn't want this to end, not when it felt this good. "Stand up," he commanded, pulling her up, not giving her any chance to refuse. Gold rose with him and the dress fell, puddling around her feet. Something seemed off about it, like her clothes should not shed so easily, but the dream wiped all doubts away. He pressed his body tight against hers. Adam groaned. "Let me please you." The request was truly a command. "I want a partner, not a servant," she responded. She turned around, momentarily disappointed that he moved his hands. But when she caught sight of Adam Luther, her breath froze in her throat. In the sunlight, his hair was closer to honey than the darker color she'd seen at night. And it was no longer bound, falling loosely around his shoulders, giving him a savage, sinful edge. At night, he was breathtakingly beautiful, but in the daylight, he was an angel of sin, not a demon. He tilted her chin up and caught her mouth with his own, kissing her in a blinding act of possession. Gold threw her arms around him to keep him close. Her heart beat fast and she was hot with anticipation. She pulled away from him and pushed until he took a step back, his legs hitting the base of the canopied bed. He fell down, taking Gold with him until she ended up splayed over his clothed body. She picked at his shirt, undoing the buttons, tearing at it when she couldn't get it off. Then his chest was bare to her, his pants the only bit of clothing left. In a blur, they were gone too, either undone by her or him, she wasn't quite sure. He kissed her again like a dying man sending the love of his life off one final time. He poured everything into it, claiming her and being claimed. "I need to taste you," he said against her lips. "I'm yours," she replied, the words almost a vow. She wanted him just as much. He kissed in a circle around her pulse, licking at the bluish veins under her skin. Gold was on fire, awash in pleasure and desperate for release. She cried out in the pleasure of fulfillment, but it turned to a sharp cry of pain as she felt fangs dig deep into her wrist. The room went dark, the sunlight pouring in through the windows vanishing as night fell with supernatural speed. Gold looked down at Adam. His eyes shone red and blood poured down the sides of his lips, pooling on the stark white sheets below them. She screamed and woke up. Gold clutched her wrist and looked around the room. The door was still locked and the window closed. Even though she rarely opened it, she got up to check that it, too, was locked. When she sat up, she moaned, her sex still tender from the arousal of the dream. She almost reached into her underwear to finish herself off, but the thought of pleasure frightened her right now. Gold changed into a pair of pajamas and returned to bed. The clock on her table told her it was only 8 o'clock. She hadn't even gotten 3 hours of sleep. The curtains over her window kept it dark, so when she saw a spot on her wrist, she thought she might have started bleeding again. She pressed down on the bandage to stem any flow before pulling it back to see if the wound had reopened. Gold gasped at what she saw. Dark lines split from the 2 faint bite marks on her wrist, looking like veins or tree branches. They wrapped around her wrist, not quite making a full circle. On the inside of her wrist, 2 of the dark marks traveled halfway up her forearm. A mark? She'd heard of this, but had never thought it would happen to her. When a huntress was marked, the weight of the family's curse settled on her. Gold had a destiny now. She had to kill Adam Luther or die trying. Chapter 6. Adam woke with the dream hot in his mind, the imprint of Marigold's lips still seared against his skin. He was on fire with desire, the evidence tented in his boxers. He sucked in a deep breath, trying to bring himself under control. Marigold's scent somehow hung in the air. He could taste her tangy blood on his tongue. It seemed so real. During the dream, Adam had been transported back into a fantasy version of his old human life. He'd merely been a man intent on seducing an irresistibly beautiful woman. He glanced over at his bedside clock and saw that it was just past 3. Daylight still. While legend had it that vampires were caught in death-like slumber during the harsh light of day, the truth, as always, was much more banal. He slept like a normal man, though usually not beset by such wicked longings. Adam rolled out of bed and walked across the dark floor to the bathroom. From the outside, his house appeared to be a modest ranch. The main floor was unimpressive, utterly ordinary. But he'd made over the basement into a palace of decadence and comfort. His bedroom and bathroom took up more than half the space, a fresco of the rising sun painted across the eastern wall. Stars bedecked the wall, fine crystals embedded that shone whenever the light from the chandelier in the middle of the room hit them. He'd spared no expense on the bathroom, including a tub that could fit half a dozen people and a freestanding shower with a waterfall faucet. There was no natural light in the basement, so Adam had installed subtle recessed fixtures around the ceiling. The light from those filtered in, giving him just enough to see by without needing to flip on the chandelier. In the bathroom, he flicked the dimmer switch, which controlled the fake sunroof in the ceiling. Vampire vision was better than a human's, but he still required some light to see by. He turned the water on cold and stepped under the thick torrent. It shocked his system, quelling his unquenchable desires and focusing his mind. Adam slowly lifted up his arm and held it before him. A cracked, dark mark branched up, crawling up from his wrist halfway to his elbow. It looked like dark lightning. He scrubbed against it with his thumb, but the mark didn't fade or smudge. Strange. But it didn't hurt to the touch, and Adam had more pressing concerns than spontaneous tattoos. He'd worry about it if he found a few spare minutes or his arm fell off. He had hours before sunset and there was no reason to waste them. He finished washing up and climbed out of the shower, drying and changing into a loose pair of sweatpants and a white shirt. He picked up his tablet and pulled up the internet. Once the search engine loaded, he typed Marigold Jones, Jasperton, Illinois, and pressed enter. It was time to do a bit of research. Gold cracked her eyes open around 2 o'clock. She threw her comforter off and caught sight of the bandage wrapped around her arm. Sick anticipation sparked through her as she picked at the tape and unwound it. There was a small patch of dried blood on the white paper towel, but otherwise she'd stopped bleeding. The mark was still there in all its black, veiny glory. She shoved her arm back under the covers and rolled over, trying to pretend that she didn't see it. But it too was hot under the blanket, and ignoring her problems wasn't going to make them go away. Gold rose with a groan and shuffled over to the bathroom. She took a quick shower and changed into a pair of shorts and a tank top. After drying herself off, she stretched out, wringing all of the lingering stiffness out of her muscles. It was what she did every morning, well, in this case, afternoon, when she woke up. A stiff huntress was a dead huntress. After finishing a few yoga sets, she went back into her bathroom and pulled the first aid kit out of the drawer. A bright white bundle of gauze sat next to a roll of surgical tape. She took them both out and carefully wrapped up her arm, completely covering the mark in 3 layers of gauze. There was no way anyone would see it by accident. Gold didn't want to deal with the questions, or the implications, just yet. She needed more information. And, hopefully, she could wait until her mom got home. She didn't need anyone else to fight her battles, but she could do with a little advice. She had to figure out how to take out Adam Luther, and the first step to any successful strategy was research. Leaving her room, Gold let the warm beams of sunlight pour over her shoulders and arms. She paused for a moment to let the warmth sink in. It was pleasant outside, not the scorching heat that summer would bring. When she walked in the kitchen door, she saw Lily and Charlie sitting in the living room on either end of the overstuffed sofa, game controllers in their hands. "Can you two come here for a minute?" she asked. The house had an open floor plan, so her voice carried. For a few seconds, neither of the kids acknowledged her, but then the game paused and they both headed over without bothering to turn off the TV. Lily was wearing one of those ridiculous fuzzy one-piece pajama suits. When she flipped up the hood, tiger ears popped up on top of her head. Charlie wore ripped jeans and a t-shirt. At 19, he was growing into his gangly height, his shoulders beginning to fill out and his face becoming more defined. Even though he was technically an adult, he hadn't quite figured out how to comb out his thick brown hair, and it shot out in all directions. Gold wasn't his mom and she wasn't going to tell him to take care of himself. Not with basic hygiene. The kids took their seats while she grabbed a piece of fruit out of the fridge. She then leaned back against the counter, tossing an apple from hand to hand. "There's been a complication," she said. "So until our moms get back, you're both on sundown curfew." The declaration caused an immediate uproar. "That's not fair," complained Charlie. "What?" demanded Lily. "Teenagers." It took a great deal of strength not to roll her eyes. "There's at least one vampire in town," she explained. "I might have sensed two." She held up her wrist and showed them the bandage. Her cousin's eyes went wide and Lily's mouth dropped open. But Gold kept talking before they could interrupt. "Disobey and you might die. Don't make me call Mom." It felt cheap to rely on her mom's authority to make the demand, but Gold wasn't going to risk their lives because of pride. "Any questions?" The kids talked over each other. "Can I help?" from Lily. "Are you sure it's a vampire?" from Charlie. They shared a glare and then looked at her expectantly. Gold was glad she didn't have kids of her own. This shit was exhausting, and she'd just woken up. "Hit the newspapers," she told them. "Look for any suspicious deaths within 100 miles. You know the signs." Even though Charlie was a boy and therefore didn't have the enhanced abilities and senses of the Jones women, he could spot a vampire attack as well as any huntress. "And if you go out after dark, I'll tie you up and leave you to the vampires myself." Chapter 7. Facebook wasn't quite a bust, but it was close. Marigold had posted a dozen or so photos over the past 6 years, most of them with family. She'd graduated from high school 7 years previously in a town in Nebraska. She was single. It was irrelevant to his search, of course, but the news pleased him. Adam could feel the connection between them. One taste of her blood, one dream, that was all it took for a tiny space inside his battered soul to open up. He just needed to figure out what it meant. Was she his salvation? Or his destruction? Adam shook his head. He was a fool. After giving up on finding any more information on social media, Adam turned to a different source, BloodNet. Some unknown vampire had started it as a joke back in the 90s, but it had grown into a small community of the undead who weren't afraid of their computers. Adam bypassed the message boards he usually trawled, book and movie recommendations and a thread called Modern World #fails and chose a subforum called Safety and Security, Staying Unalive. Most threads there were tips for newbies on how to stay out of the sun and proper feeding schedules. But 5 pages in there was a thread called Keep Away from the Joneses, which caught Adam's eye. Marigold Jones. Joneses. Sounded like just the thing he was looking for. The original post was from a man named Kyle who lived somewhere in the western US. He'd run into a woman armed to her teeth with the knowledge of how to fight vampires. She was able to injure him, but when he got the upper hand, she threw down a flash grenade and was gone before he regained his senses. Others joined in after that poster, sharing stories going back centuries about meeting similar women and, on rare occasions, men. The women always seemed to have some sort of sixth sense when it came to hunting the undead, and some of the members of the board shared stories of friends they'd lost to the huntresses. Over the years, Adam had run into his fair share of hunters and huntresses, but he'd never had a hint that they could all belong to the same family. Though it was likely that the Joneses were not the only ones who hunted. He continued reading. More posts said that they went by many names and were present on every inhabited continent. In North America, they were the Joneses, a family of vampire hunters almost preternaturally good at their job. After 2 pages of similar stories, the original poster came back. He posted a photo of his torso with the caption, "There was a mark on his side, dark, lines arcing out like lightning bolts." Adam looked down at his own wrist. The markings weren't identical, but there was an alarming similarity. The vampires of the board posted rampant speculation that went on for pages. But Kyle didn't reply. The topic fizzled out after a dozen more posts, and the thread hadn't been updated in more than a year. With a sinking feeling in his gut, Adam navigated to the In Memoriam board. On September 6, 2011, the moderator posted that Kyle had disappeared, presumed dead. Adam set his tablet down on the table and traced his wrist. This was bad. It was worse than she thought. Gold had retreated to the basement where they kept the family journals and research material. The leather-bound books dated back centuries, before the first Jones woman crossed the Atlantic in pursuit of a ship full of zombies. The first recorded sighting of Luther in the States was in 1826. He'd taken up with a band of thieves roaming Appalachia. From 1826 to 1829, her ancestor Hester Jones charted at least 46 murders. All vampiric, all suspected to have been committed by Adam Luther. He'd had a taste for the innocent, seducing young women, taking them from their homes, gallivanting for months or years, and then draining them dry when he'd had his fun. But most of his kills had been middle-aged men, usually laborers, but with no other traits to connect them. The trail of bodies went cold during the Civil War. There was no way to trace vampires among that much carnage. Wars were violent buffets to the undead, summoning ghouls, zombies, and vampires alike. An easy meal if you could avoid the bullets. After the war, he was spotted again in Florida, a strange place for something, that couldn't go out into the sun. He traveled from place to place, staying for a year in one town in Missouri, for 3 in Colorado, and everywhere, the bodies piled up. But there was something strange. Each time the pattern changed. Her ancestor Hester said he preferred pretty girls. Constance, Hester's granddaughter, recorded that he attacked young men in their prime, all blonde and strapping. Emmeline, another ancestor, noted that he would take advantage of aged women, killing them and stealing everything he could. From place to place the mode changed, almost like each sighting of Adam Luther was actually a different vampire. He disappeared completely in 1966. Gold flipped through the rest of the journals and double-checked on their computer database, but there was nothing recorded about him after the 60s. He was gone. Just living in suburbia and working at a bookshop. The bookstore. If he wasn't in her records, he might be in the town's. She racked her brain, trying to remember the name of the bookshop. It was something stupid and alliterative. Lovely Lit? Beyond Books? Lit Love? Lots of lit, that was it. Gold pulled up the website and smiled. The owner was listed as Andrew Luthman, though there was no picture. According to the Short About Us section, he'd purchased the store 12 years ago and had owned it ever since. As disturbing as the thought that Adam Luther, notorious vampire, had lived in the same town as her for years was, Gold was relieved. She had a name, and with a name came records. All she had to do was call up some friends at City Hall and maybe she'd be lucky enough to hit the jackpot. She reached for her cell phone before she remembered that she dropped it last night. Biting back a curse and making a mental note to drop by the store, she picked up the landline on the table and dialed her mom's friend Mrs. Cortez, who worked for the city planner. After leaving a message on Mrs. Cortez's voicemail, she leaned back in her chair and relaxed her shoulders. That lasted all of 2 minutes until Lily was screaming, "Sis! You need to see this." It didn't sound like anyone was bleeding, so Gold didn't run. But she took the stairs 2 at a time just in case. When she got upstairs, Lily waved around a newspaper, practically jumping from foot to foot. "I found something." "We found something," Charlie corrected. He wasn't as excited as her sister, and he was showing it by sitting on the couch with his arms crossed. "Just show me," Gold said, not willing to play referee. Lily handed over the newspaper, pointing to an article halfway down the page. "Her name was Hannah Behrens, and I'm pretty sure she was killed by a vampire." Chapter 8. There was only so much he could learn from rumors on a secret internet forum. After an hour of hunting for anything more substantial than Kyle's story and disappearance, Adam gave up and turned to the stacks of the Chicago Tribune piling up in his living room. He normally kept a few months' worth of papers by grace of the fact that he was too lazy to throw them out with any frequency. O'Connell had told him about Hannah Behrens, but that didn't mean that she was his first victim in Chicago. He found a copy of the same paper that O'Connell had given him. It was dated 2 weeks ago, but he recognized the image on the cover. He flipped to the correct page and read the article about Behrens' death again. Her roommate had reported her missing more than a week before she showed up on the beach. There was a follow-up to the original story 2 days later. The police report stated that she'd been alive for a few days and had been in the water for less than 12 hours. Speculation turned from an accident to foul play. Behrens' family was pleading for any information that would lead to an arrest of the perpetrator. Then Adam started to look backward. It was slow, incredibly depressing work. Death, murder, was no stranger to the Windy City, but the crimes he was looking for were not so common. He flipped through the newspapers quickly, eyes lighting over possible victims. After scanning back 6 months, he only found 2 more young women whose stories were similar to that of Hannah Behrens. Disappeared and then found mutilated, washed up from the lake, about a week later. Each of the disappearances had happened over the last 3 months. And he would never have known about them if O'Connell hadn't told him. Adam picked up one of the papers from after Behrens was found just to make sure that there were no other murders. Then he cursed. On page 6, a headline read, "Roommate of slain girl disappears." Wendy Choi had disappeared from her dorm room a week previously, Adam read. When the police came to question her, she wasn't there. Further investigation revealed that she hadn't been seen by fellow students in a day or 2 and her parents and friends didn't know where she was. That was nearly a week ago. If O'Connell had her, her hours were numbered. But Adam doubted that she was dead yet. Rather, he hoped that she was alive. Adam's mind raced as he thought through exactly what O'Connell could be doing to her. He'd spent so many hours reading through his papers that it was just after sunset. O'Connell could be planning to kill her tonight, and there wasn't anything that Adam could do to stop it. No, that wasn't quite correct. There was one thing. O'Connell had invited Adam into his little game, not realizing that Adam wasn't up for it anymore. Even when they'd torn up Europe after the war, Adam had lost the taste for violence that O'Connell seemed to revel in. It had been a long, slow road for Adam to grow a sense of right and wrong, but almost as soon as he turned O'Connell, Adam had known that it was a mistake. He couldn't fix that one right now, but he could begin by saving one of O'Connell's victims. Though to do so, he'd need to talk to his old friend. Adam looked around for the business card that O'Connell had left for him, but he realized that it was still sitting on his desk in the back room of the bookstore. If he went back there, Marigold Jones was sure to be waiting for him. A keen bite of anticipation hit him. She was a dangerous woman, one he should avoid at all costs. But if her kiss in real life was anything like that dream, it would almost be worth it to die in her arms. He knew that he should say no to this damned temptation, but he didn't know how. Lord in heaven, give him another day to get to know her and he'd be composing sonnets. At the moment, he only had one question: was she dangerous enough? O'Connell had survived for decades, nearly a century, on his wits and his violence. He'd never hesitated to take a life, and he wouldn't pause to spare a pretty girl. Marigold Jones was more than a pretty girl, and she'd come armed for bear. He didn't know her, but he knew that down to his core. And if it came down to slaying a vampire or saving a human, she'd save the person every time. He had no logical way to be sure of that, but it felt so true that he couldn't budge the belief from his mind. Now all he had to do was find out where the man who'd soon want to kill him was keeping his victim so that Adam could lead the woman that wanted to kill him there. Nothing too dangerous about that. Adam got ready and left his house, arriving at the bookshop just after 8. It was still a little light out, but the waning light of the sun was weak enough that it was only an unpleasant pressure against his skin. If he stayed out long enough, he might bruise, but he wouldn't get the horrible scars and burns that would come from morning or midday light. One of his employees, James, was cleaning up for the night when Adam walked in. "I thought you weren't coming in," the college student said. Adam smiled. "I'm not here, just ignore me." This was one of those moments where it would have been nice to have the fabled psychic vampire powers, but it wasn't so. However, James took it as a joke and didn't bother Adam as he walked through the narrow shelves to the back room. He picked up the card and was out in a flash, practically running toward Hydale Park. He had company. If it hadn't been for centuries of paying attention to his surroundings, he wouldn't have heard Marigold. She walked lightly, but he was moving too fast for her to be silent. He also had nearly a block ahead of her. He crossed into the park and pulled out his cell phone while waiting for Marigold to catch up. He only hoped that she didn't attack before she heard everything he had to say. The phone rang 3 times before O'Connell bothered to pick up and greet him. "I'm up for a bit of sport," Adam said, cutting right to the chase. O'Connell gave one of his deep-throated laughs, pure pleasure at the thought of a game with an old friend. "I knew you had it in you, old man." "Let's keep this private," Adam cautioned, trying to keep the disgust out of his voice. "I haven't shared a woman in years, but I remember the good old days." It hadn't really been about depth then, but blood and the feed were the closest thing to sex that a vampire could have. They'd even called the girls their lovers, but it hadn't been enough for O'Connell. Adam had tried to pretend that it didn't bother him. But it was the issue that had eventually led to them parting ways after the war. O'Connell didn't seem to remember that part. Or he was so eager for a companion to share in his debauchery that he didn't care about it. "I've got just the thing. It will ease you back into it." He gave Adam an address for a building in Jasperton. "I thought you said you were in Chicago." Keeping the anger out of his voice was difficult, but after 3 centuries lying was second nature. The persona of the old Adam Luther fit like a noose, but he'd wear it for long enough to get this done. "That's where I live, my friend. I like to dine out." He didn't apologize, he probably didn't think he needed to. Adam hung up the phone after they agreed on a time. If he talked for too long, he might let something slip. That was another trick of the accomplished liar: keep it short and let others sort out the details. Wariness assailed Adam, nipping at his feet, trying to topple him. If he failed in this mission, Wendy Choi was a dead woman. There would be no second chance to retrieve her. Once O'Connell knew that his torture den was compromised, he'd move quickly to destroy any trace that he'd ever been there. And then he would come for Adam? This was atonement, not total and never complete, for the sins of his past, for bringing O'Connell into this world. In some way, it was Adam's fault that Wendy Choi was in danger in the first place, so it was his duty to protect her. Even if it killed her quicker. It was almost time to go. But first, Adam spoke out into the darkness where he knew that Marigold was listening. "I know you have no reason to trust me, huntress. But if you want to save an innocent life, come with me." Chapter 9. She shouldn't have been surprised when he talked to her, but Gold froze where she stood, hiding behind one of the old oaks that lined the sidewalk around Hydale Park. She clutched a hardened wooden stake in one hand. It was next to useless against humans, but a stake through the heart was the surest way to kill the undead. She'd come here to fight Luther, not to talk. Every word he spoke on the phone had convinced her that she'd made the right call, despite the dream. Not that she normally based her life choices off of sex dreams. But now, when he talked to her, he didn't sound like the jaded libertine who'd made the phone call. He sounded like a wary man, full of remorse. So which was real? Was someone really in danger, or was this a clumsy trap? She stepped out from behind the tree, but she didn't put her stake away. Gold tried to think of something to say, but she had nothing. Instead, she cocked her hip to the side and raised an eyebrow. He wanted to talk, let him explain himself. Adam waited for her to reply, but Gold kept her mouth shut. Finally, he relented. "There's a girl," he explained. "Her name is Wendy Choi and she's being held by a particularly nasty vampire at the old Great West Hotel on Route 30. Did he really think she was that stupid? Yeah, it sounded like you were looking forward to eating her. He probably realized that she'd overheard his call, but he'd sounded like he couldn't wait to sink his fangs into innocent flesh. Luther shrugged. Subterfuge. The light from one of the park's lamps illuminated him from behind, casting light on his shoulders and the top of his head. His hair was pulled back again and Gold's fingers itched to give it a little tug. It looked so soft. He'd just discussed eating someone and he was trying to lead her into a trap. She knew she shouldn't find him handsome. So what's this? Why should she trust him now? There was no reason to believe that this conversation was the real one. He was a vampire. Vampires killed people. She should just stake him now and be done with it. Real frustration peeked through Luther's voice. "Are we going to fight and let a young woman die, huntress?" He taunted. Her duties ward. It was her family's sacred mission to cleanse the earth of vampires. But they did so to protect human life. The gauze on her arm was a reminder of what she had to do to Adam Luther, but she couldn't risk letting an innocent be killed. Even if this was a trap. "If you're lying, I'm going to kill you." Even if he wasn't lying, she'd have to kill him anyway. She took off for the Great West Hotel, leaving Luther behind. It had been closed down for as long as she'd lived in Jasperton, the faded sign getting a little more decrepit each year. But it was out of the way and still standing, which made it a perfect place for squatters. And for vampires. She pulled into a mechanic's shop just up the road, the hotel in sight. The shop was closed for the night, but her black car didn't stand out. Once she put it in park, she opened up her senses, scanning for a vampire besides Adam Luther. Sickness burbled in her throat as a torrent of blood spilled over her mind, boiling hot and thick. She could smell it in the air around her, and when she opened her eyes, everything was red for a moment. This was the same vampire she'd sensed last night, his mind and bloodlust even stronger than before. That was the taste of evil. Compared to this monster, Luther felt like a balmy day on the beach when she sensed him driving down the highway. His car, a red sporty sedan, drove down the road, passing her in a flash. Gold counted to 60 before starting her car and chasing after him. If she was trying for stealth, she would have never driven straight to the hotel. But when facing a vampire, there was little reason to be quiet. They'd hear her coming no matter what. Just because they'd hear her didn't mean she wouldn't exercise caution. The Great West Hotel had been a cheap little roadside inn and was now a decrepit, former cheap little roadside inn. Half the roof had fallen in on the north side of the building, but the south side was more or less intact. The windows had been boarded up ages ago, but they were no deterrent to anyone who wanted to get inside. Gold checked her weapons one last time before entering. She'd pocketed her stake and felt the comforting weight of the modified revolver she was carrying. It was armed with steel-core wooden bullets and prone to jamming, but in an abandoned building with little risk of injuring bystanders, it was easier to shoot a monster than to stake him. She carried one large knife in a sheath on her thigh. It was a silver alloy, less effective for killing vampires, but it would still injure them and just about any other supernatural menace. Any more gear and she'd be weighed down, unable to move quickly enough to fight. Instead of entering through the front door like Adam, she circled around to the back of the building, where she found a half-boarded-up fire exit. She yanked at the loosened wood until it gave with a great crack, the sound echoing inside the old hotel. If they hadn't seen her already, they'd hear her now. Her first priority was to find the girl, if she existed. There was a greater than zero chance that Adam was waiting to pounce on her, luring her out to make disposing of her body a simple matter. Gold cursed herself for coming. This wasn't smart. In fact, it bordered on suicidal. But once she made it into the debris-strewn lobby, there was a trail of blood that led up a flight of stairs and into one of the rooms. Tipped over, broken furniture lay everywhere. Gold stayed crouched low and pulled out her revolver before slowly making her way up the stairs. If anything moved toward her, she'd shoot. The second floor was open to the lobby area, a half-wall blocking the unsuspecting from falling from one floor to the other. Luther and the other vampire were close. She could sense them a room over, but she couldn't see them. She followed the trail of blood into the first bedroom on the second floor. A barren mattress was pushed up against the wall, and on it lay a young woman in a bloodied orange dress, her hands bound with rope tied around an old radiator pipe. When Gold got close, she could see that the girl, Wendy, Adam had called her, was in bad shape. She holstered her gun and took out her knife, trying to saw through the thick rope as quickly as she could. Bite marks covered Wendy's neck and arms, and peeked out from under her dress. A trickle of blood dripped from her mouth. Gold worried that she was too late, but Wendy's chest rose and fell as she breathed. A sick suspicion rolling in her gut, she reached out and ran her finger against the still wet blood at Wendy's mouth. It was almost black, too dark to be human, and when she held her finger close to her nose she caught a faint hint of moss. Human blood didn't smell like that. The sick vampire hadn't just been feeding on Wendy. He'd been trying to turn her. Giving a human vampiric blood was one of the first steps to start the transformation. Not knowing how long Wendy had been under the vampire's thrall, Gold didn't know how far along the change had progressed. She reached into the pocket of her leather jacket and pulled out a silver disc with a small ruby embedded in the center. She'd picked up the charm from a witch after one of her first solo hunts. It wasn't good for much, but it could tell her if Wendy was still human. Gold pressed the silver to Wendy's skin and counted to 3. When she pulled it back, the girl's flesh was unharmed and the red gem didn't glow. Still human. If she'd been turned, the skin beneath the charm would have bubbled and burned. She went back to cutting the rope, Wendy's unconsciousness making the job easier. She didn't need to comfort the girl and save her at the same time. When the two vampires started moving closer, she worked faster. "You brought your own snack?" That wasn't Luther talking. This vampire had a nasally American accent, like he was from New York or somewhere like it. She couldn't see his face, only making out a glimpse of his black hair through a hole in the wall. "She doesn't know that, O'Connell," said Luther. Alarm zinged through her, but she reminded herself that he had to lie. Still, she worked quickly, afraid that her first instinct had been right and that this was a trap. "Why is she with my human?" O'Connell asked. "I think she's trying to rescue her." He sounded amused. "You know those Buffy types? Watch a TV show and they think they're heroes." He put on his libertine voice again. The one he used when he was playing a role. She couldn't know that, but it felt so right that she couldn't stop believing it. Up until Adam Luther, she'd never been tempted to trust a vampire, but with him, it was almost impossible not to. As she sawed at the rope, she caught sight of the bandage under her sleeve. That was a harsh reminder that it didn't matter whether she trusted him, she had a duty. "And you were the glowering hero?" O'Connell laughed. "Oh, my boy, you played a type." The rope frayed and broke with a final stroke of her blade, freeing Wendy from the pipe. Her hands were still bound, but Gold was making progress. She put her knife away and loosened the rope around Wendy's hands until it fell free. It took a little maneuvering, but Gold's only real option was to sling Wendy over her shoulder and pull out her revolver. Her aim would be crap and her balance off, but she'd be a sitting, hobbling, duck otherwise. When Gold picked Wendy up, the girl started to groan in pain. Gold hissed out something almost like a hush, though she knew Wendy couldn't hear her. The vampires already knew what she was doing, but she was running out of time if Adam was really distracting O'Connell for her. "I think she's at her fun," said O'Connell. "Would you like to do the honors? She is yours, after all." Here it was, the moment of truth. Gold started to move. Each step that she took was a step she wouldn't have to fight for later. Adam clicked his tongue and sucked in a breath. "Yeah," he said, "that's not going to work for me." For 2 seconds, there was absolute silence as O'Connell processed his words. "What?" he finally asked. There was a crash, and a cloud of dust appeared through the hole in the wall. She heard growls and fists connecting with flesh. The mossy scent of vampiric blood soaked the air as the two men fought. Gold worked in double time, taking the stairs as quickly as she could with a woman slung over her shoulder and a gun in her hand. It was too slow, she knew it with every step, but any faster and she'd trip and face plant, probably breaking her neck in the process, if not Wendy's as well. It took too long, but they made it to the bottom, Wendy starting to stir, the incredible pain she had to be in finally getting through the haze of unconsciousness. "War," she mumbled, the words jumbled together, not making any sense. "Shh," Gold whispered, "I'm here to help." Her shoulder was killing her, but she couldn't stop. Not with the front door in sight. With a crack and a crash, the vampires fell through the half wall on the second floor, landing in a heap on top of a broken couch. Before the dust settled and Gold could see, O'Connell was on her, grabbing her away from Wendy, claws like nails ripping at her chest. Blood dripped from the wound before she felt the pain of the tear. On instinct, Gold pointed her gun down and fired at his feet, rolling away when he yelped in pain as one of her bullets shot through his foot. She found cover behind a pushed-over table, but O'Connell's pain didn't last long enough, and he was coming toward her again before she knew it. She fired again, 2 more rounds in his direction. Neither one hit the mark. He tackled her, kneeling over her, his eyes red with fury and bloodlust. His fangs had grown huge, like a prehistoric tiger's. They'd rip her throat out in a second. "I'm sorry, Lily. I should have said goodbye." She didn't close her eyes. She wouldn't meet her fate as a coward. But in the moment she was sure that O'Connell would strike her down, he disappeared, his weight vanished as if by magic. She scrambled up and saw that it was not magic, but Adam who had saved her. He was pummeling into O'Connell, fists moving at inhuman speeds. Gold raised her gun, trying to get a shot off to take out the evil vampire, but with Adam on top of him she didn't have a shot. Besides, her hand shook so much from the pulling wound on her chest that she couldn't trust her aim. She crawled toward Wendy. It didn't matter that Gold was getting dizzy from the blood loss. She was getting this girl out of here. It was a struggle. She couldn't carry Wendy anymore, not with her muscles ripped open. Gold holstered her gun, leaving her life in Adam's hands. She hooked her arms under Wendy's armpits and dragged her, the girl whimpering the entire way out the front door and across the loose gravel to her car. "Marigold!" She heard Adam scream. A flash out of the corner of her eye and O'Connell was on them again, his face even more misshapen and monstrous than before. He couldn't even stand up completely straight. This time, he didn't go for Gold, grasping instead for the semi-conscious Wendy. Gold reached for her gun and aimed, but O'Connell had Wendy in front of him, unintentionally using her as a human shield as he pulled her in position to drink from her neck. They'd made it this far, they'd gotten to Gold's SUV, and still Wendy was going to die. And then the strangest thing happened. O'Connell dropped Wendy, tilted his head back and shrieked, his voice achingly high. Gold winced and instinctively took a step back, turning away from him and trying to block out the sound. He took off, leaving Wendy on the ground and passing by Adam without a look. It was a godsend, a miracle that she couldn't explain. But she wouldn't risk sticking around and they needed to move fast. She didn't know what spooked O'Connell, but anything that scared a vampire away was too scary for her to fight while injured and defending an even more injured young woman. Adam limped up to her as she was loading Wendy into the back seat. He clutched at his stomach, blood seeping out onto his gray t-shirt. "We need to get out of here," he said, climbing into the passenger seat. Gold climbed into the SUV and took off. She was 2 miles down the road before she remembered that they'd come in different cars. "What's the matter?" she asked. Adam looked over at her, face pale and clammy, eyes stark. "The shit's about to hit the fan." Chapter 10. Adam's mind was a jumble and his gut was on fire. He breathed shallowly, hoping the hole in his side would hurry up and close, but he wasn't the one in the most trouble. The scent of human blood hung thick in the air, as it seeped sluggishly from the gash on Marigold's chest and oozed out of the bite marks dotted all over Wendy Choi. Marigold drove directly to St. Mary's Hospital in Jasperton. Without speaking, they dropped Wendy off, waiting in the shadows until they were sure that the staff had seen her. Then it was back to the car. Marigold had gone pale and her eyes were glassy. Her mouth pulled tight and she winced every time she turned the steering wheel. "You need to get that wound treated," he said. It wasn't Adam's place to care for her, but he didn't like to see her hurt. Especially since she'd been injured helping him. She kept her eyes glued to the highway in front of them. "It's not as bad as it looks," she said, silence filling the air between them again when he didn't respond. After a few minutes, he realized that she was taking him back downtown. Adam hadn't meant to get in her car back at the hotel, he hadn't intended to see her again after tonight. But then O'Connell had succumbed and nearly taken Marigold out in his madness. He'd never seen it happen like that. Most tales of blood madness were just stories passed from vampire to vampire. They knew it existed, but to see the exact moment it took hold was rare. It had happened so fast that he'd acted on his instinct to protect both Marigold and Wendy from a dangerous threat. Marigold pulled downtown and parked her SUV right outside of his bookshop. It was just after midnight according to the clock on the dashboard, and the town was deserted. For the first time since they'd gotten in the car together, she turned toward him, her eyes hard, and said, "This ceasefire ends at sunup." Was that what this was? Merely a ceasefire? Yes, he'd tried to feed from her, but other than that, he'd done her no harm. He hadn't come for her people, or for anyone else in this town. And when he found a threat, he helped her to eliminate it, or at least he tried to. Still, she could only see him as a vampire. "Marigold," he began before she cut him off. "Just gold," she said. "What?" She rolled her eyes. "Only my grandma calls me Marigold. It makes me sound like a pony or something." Adam smiled. "Very well, gold." "Thank you," she bit out. "Now go." Adam couldn't leave it at that. "Would you believe that I don't kill people?" he asked. He didn't want to act as ambassador for the good vampires, but the thought of Gold thinking that he was a monster caused his soul to ache. Gold narrowed her eyes and scowled. "You're Adam freaking Luther. I know what you are." So she knew of his exploits and of his past. Wonderful. But he was not that man any longer. Adam shook his head and said, "Not for a long time." She didn't buy it. She pointed her finger toward his door. "Out. Now. I'm not going to argue with you." Adam didn't want to leave. Despite the fact that she clearly hated him, despite the fact that she promised to kill him, and despite the fact that they were natural enemies, he wanted to see if he could make her smile. But that wasn't going to happen tonight, if ever. She'd probably call him delusional for thinking there was anything other than hatred there, but Adam could feel it. It was real, he was certain. He reached for the handle, but turned back to her before he opened the door. "O'Connell's gone blood mad. He'll terrorize the town," he warned. The vampire would be motivated only by his hunger. There would be no reasoning with him, no threats. Only violence. Gold stuttered and corrected herself, "I can take on a single vamp." That she'd almost said wasn't referring to the two of them. She was protecting someone, probably multiple someones. It didn't surprise Adam. After all, it would be suicide to hunt vampires and other monsters alone. Still, Adam's eyes fell to her wounded chest. He'd been trying to ignore the siren scent of her blood filling up the vehicle. His fangs ached, the pressure growing with his own need for blood to heal himself. Her blood had been so powerful the night before that he knew it would only take a couple of sips from her to sate him. Who was he kidding? Once he sank himself deep into her, he'd never be satisfied with only a taste. "Just go." She sounded exhausted and her shoulders were beginning to sag. There was nothing that he could do to help her, nothing that she would accept anyway, except for him to leave her alone. So Adam gave her the solitude that she wanted, opening the car door and stepping out onto the silent street. He made it a few steps when her horn beeped behind him. He spun around, half worried that she had changed her mind about détente and was about to plow into him. What he saw instead made his heart stutter. Gold was draped across the front of the steering wheel, limp. Adam crossed back to the SUV in 3 big steps, yanking open the driver's door, undoing Gold's seat belt, and pulling her out of the car. She pushed against him, not unconscious, but too weak to resist. "I just need a minute," she mumbled. Of course his huntress was a hard ass. She wouldn't have admitted that she was down for the count even if O'Connell had ripped an arm off. Adam just made soothing sounds at her, knowing that she wouldn't care for anything he said. He shut the car door with his foot and carried her to the store, using the spare key hidden behind a loose brick to let himself in. A narrow staircase behind a flimsy door in the back office led him to the basement. His emergency hideaway was behind a thick metal door. He'd built the room as a backup in case he was ever caught out before sunrise or something happened to his home. All of the employees thought it was a private maintenance room and none were allowed to go back there. It was a simple room with a bed set up in the corner and a bookshelf pushed against the concrete wall opposite. The small bathroom only had a toilet and sink, and there wasn't a door. Utilitarian, to say the least, but it was a place meant for survival, not leisure. Adam pulled back the comforter and pushed it to the floor, laying the bloodied huntress down on the light green cotton sheets. Gold rolled her eyes over toward him and mumbled, "Why are you doing this?" "You need stitches," he said, ignoring the question. He left her alone for a moment, confident that she wasn't going to go anywhere. Adam ran upstairs and grabbed the first aid kit off the wall of the employee break room. Room was a generous term as it was just one small table tucked into the corner of the back office, surrounded by boxes and piles of books. He grabbed a bottle of water and a roll of paper towels as well. By the time he got back to the safe room, Gold had struggled up into a sitting position and removed her leather jacket and tossed it on the floor. She'd also removed her weapons, but those she kept within reach. Her fingers brushed against the hilt of a wicked-looking knife. Maybe he really was suicidal. Adam sat down beside her and wet a paper towel. For a moment he considered asking her to remove her shirt so that he could tend to her wound, but he quickly decided against it. There was no way that she'd agree. Besides, O'Connell had ripped a nasty hole in her black t-shirt. There was more than enough space to maneuver around. He tried to gently clean up around her injury, but she hissed in pain and snatched the towel from his hand, wiping herself down with harsh efficiency. He handed her a dry piece of towel and let her pat away the water. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was clearer this time. Sitting still was probably doing wonders for that. When he pulled out the gauze and surgical tape, she tried to grab for it, but Adam kept it away. "Just let me do this part." He looked her in the eye when she said it, and when their gazes locked, he felt lightning dancing across his skin. No, Gold wasn't his enemy. Not when just looking at her made him feel this way. Now he just had to make her see that. Her blood dripped onto his fingers as he taped up the wound. The smell was going to his head, making him dizzy, making him yearn. He healed up several minutes before and his own pain was nearly gone, but he needed blood to replenish what he'd lost. Soon. Gold smelled like a decadent feast before him. Adam did his best to ignore it. There was a thick bandage on her arm, right where he'd bitten her the night before. He pushed away the memory of her taste and rejected any thoughts of the dream he'd had. The bandage was wet with fresh blood, probably from her chest, but he needed to make certain. He reached for the small pair of scissors in the first aid kit and cut off the gauze. Gold jerked her arm back and held it close to her chest, wincing when she thumped it against her fresh bandage. "What is that?" he asked. Her arm bore markings strikingly similar to the ones on his own. She must have seen that they bore matching magical tattoos. Adam hadn't tried to hide his, but she'd said nothing. Gold spread her fingers wide, trying to cover up the black lines. "Don't worry about it," she said in dismissal. Magic was always worth worrying about. "It's weird. It's temporary," she assured him. But she wasn't saying something important. Adam reached over, wanting to pull her arm close to get a better look. When his arm brushed against hers, the marks both glowed, a hazy light of shining obsidian. "Are you human?" It slipped out before he could think better of it, accidentally accusatory, but Gold was remarkable. And humans didn't have glowing skin. Neither did vampires, usually. "Yes." She sounded so offended that he almost laughed. What kind of question is that? Maybe she thought she was human, but there was something extra in there. Not vampire, but something from some magical ancestor generations ago. "O'Connell didn't kill you." Adam talked it out. He was moving fast enough that he could have. "That means you're tougher than a human." "Faster too? And your blood?" With her blood still wet on his hands and her injury so fresh, he knew he needed to stop before he said something that made her reach for her knife. But Gold wasn't going to let it drop. "What about my blood?" Adam swallowed hard. Thinking about her blood was becoming almost sexual. He needed to change the subject quick. "It's ahem. Very good. Powerful." "Are you saying I'm delicious?" There was a glint in those blue eyes of hers. Her hair had fallen across her face. Adam reached up and tugged it back behind her ear. When he touched her, they both froze. Gold gulped. Adam pulled back and lifted up his hand. A few drops of fresh blood coated his index finger. He put it in his mouth and licked it clean. "You're intoxicating, Marigold Jones." Chapter 11. Gold got out of there. If she didn't, she was going to do something stupid. Like fight him. Or fuck him. Luther didn't try to stop her, and she didn't know what she would have done if he had. The half hour or so of rest was enough for her to recuperate enough to drive. She made it home without incident, and for the second night in a row went to bed in her hunting clothes, covered in blood. The next day, Gold couldn't hide her injuries from her sister or her cousin. They saw it in her stiffness long before they glimpsed the thick bandage under her t-shirt. But it was a school day, so Lily didn't have a long time to get on Gold's case before she had to catch the bus. Gold dealt with Charlie's questions and glares until he left for his own classes around 10. Since she only went to school part-time, her schedule wasn't nearly as dense as that of the kids. Still, the temptation to remain home and just lay in her bed for the entire day was great. It felt like she had a 1,000-pound weight strapped to her back, and doing the tiniest things left her tired. And none of that stacked up against the pain she felt when she tried to lift anything heavier than a feather. But Gold sucked it up and went to class in the afternoon, wearing bulky clothes to disguise her injuries. She kept her arm wrapped up as well. The next few days went on like that, with her stumbling through classes, sleeping a lot, and keeping off the streets. She didn't explain it all to Charlie and Lily, other than to tell them that there was still a dangerous vampire out there. One who had gone mad and monstrous. She didn't give them more information about Luther either. Things between them were too weird to explain. Though she knew there wasn't actually anything between them. Sure, they'd saved a girl's life together. And sure, he tended her wounds and said she tasted intoxicating. Gold shivered even thinking of it before pushing the thought away. It meant nothing. She was wearing long sleeves despite the late spring heat, keeping the mark on her arm covered. Over 3 days, it had grown darker and longer, lines stretching closer to her elbow. She wasn't ignoring it, not really. Gold told herself that she needed to tend to her injuries before she could even think of facing Adam Luther as an enemy. That was just common sense. But she hadn't quite explained to herself why she was keeping the mark a secret from her family. 3 nights after her encounter with both vampires, Gold found herself walking into lots of lit. This time, she was there on official business. Well, official school business. When Gold left the house, Lily had rushed into the garage and threatened to call their mom if Gold even thought of going on patrol. When Gold explained that she was just going to get a book for class, Lily had relented. And then she'd asked to come with. At that point, Gold put her foot down. The kids were still under curfew and she wasn't going to let either one of them go out after dark until O'Connell was dealt with. Besides, she really did need a book for one of her classes, and lots of lit had been the first place to pop into her mind. Sure, she could have gone to the Barnes and Noble over in Naperville, but something was pushing her to support local businesses. And it had nothing to do with Adam Luther. It was merely a coincidence that she didn't get to the bookshop until nearly an hour after sunset. Yeah, right? Even at her most delusional, she didn't believe that. The bell rang when Gold pushed open the door. Soft music piped through the speakers and a few patrons stocked the shelves. It was nearly dark, but it wasn't too late. A kid who was probably around Charlie's age sat at the register reading a magazine. Now that she was inside the store, doubt assailed her. She was still injured and couldn't take on a vampire in her condition. It would be at least a week until she felt strong enough to hunt again. She'd only given Adam a one-day truce. Coming to his place of business was an act of aggression. She needed to leave before he saw her. What if he wanted a fight? Still, she did need her book. This was madness. She was going crazy. That was the only way to explain it. Rather than stalk the aisles, she walked up to the register and asked the kid working there if they had what she needed. He shrugged and said he'd go check. Minutes ticked by. Gold looked around, her eyes falling on a table of gift books next to the register. She picked up one and started paging through while waiting for the kid to come back. A few minutes later, she saw someone approaching out of the corner of her eye. Adam. He doesn't know, he said, instead of hello. He sounded pissed, on edge, and ready to fight. Under normal circumstances, that would have ratcheted up Gold's heartbeat and had her reaching for a weapon. For some reason, Adam didn't trigger that instinct within her. Doesn't know what? She asked. They'd started the conversation in the middle and she wasn't sure what he was talking about. Don't threaten my people. Adam growled. It did something to her stomach, made it tighten in the strangest way. If he'd been human. But he wasn't, and it didn't matter what she felt. His eyes were dark, brows drawn down as he loomed over her. I just came to shop. Every second she spent around Adam threw her into a tailspin of confusion. He was a vampire. A bloodsucker. She needed to either stake him or run the hell away. But what kind of vampire tended a huntress's wounds? What kind of vampire defended humans he wasn't using? He still wasn't convinced. This is between us. What is this? There wasn't anything for there to be a this. Nothing except a one-night stand, one-night team-up, she corrected, and some weird dreams. Sexual dreams that wouldn't let up, making her hot and confused. You said the ceasefire is over. I'm only protecting what is mine. He was full of righteous anger, and it was magnificent. If he had been anyone else, she would have reached up and kissed him right there. No. If he'd been human, she would have done it. She didn't want just anyone. She only wanted the version of him that she didn't need to kill. I'm not coming for you tonight. At least, she wasn't going to kill him. Those dreams, and what those dreams made her do when she woke up, were another matter altogether. Adam placed a brown paper bag on the counter. Here's what you came for then. He held up a hand when she reached for her wallet. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? She didn't mean it as any great statement, but now her heartbeat picked up and adrenaline started to flow. This time it had nothing to do with violence. Adam sucked in a deep breath. I don't know, he admitted. He stared into her eyes and she could feel herself sinking, focus narrowing until there was nothing but him and her. Oh. She breathed it out, unsure of how to really respond. Then reality reasserted itself. This wasn't happening. I've got to go. She snatched the bag up from the counter and fled. Again. Running away from Adam Luther was becoming a bad habit. When she got to the car, she spilled the bag over it and saw that Adam had given her 2 books in addition to what she'd asked for. The first one was The Art of War, the second Pride and Prejudice. On the cover of the Austen novel, there was a sticky note with Adam's handwriting. Your choice, Huntress. Chapter 12. Adam was a fool. He'd spent the last week pining after the Huntress and hoping she'd return to the store, knowing he was even more an idiot for changing his mind about abandoning it. Each morning as he curled up in his bed just past sunrise, he'd close his eyes and let the increasingly erotic dreams take over. And when he'd woken up today, he'd been certain that if he only stroked himself long enough, he'd find his release. But it didn't work like that for vampires, and he was not fool enough to try. He should have never taken her blood. It had been a foolish move after she'd left him, but it had been everywhere and he'd been so thirsty. All told, he'd been able to scrape together enough to get a good taste, but not a satisfying feed. Yet it was only now, more than a week later, that the first pangs of hunger were starting to hit him. He'd have to find someone to sate it, but after his taste of gold, he didn't know how anyone would live up to it ever again. If vampires could become addicted, then he was well on the road to being hooked on her. In an effort to keep at least some level of sanity, Adam had doubled down on his quest to find O'Connell. There'd been no sign of him since he disappeared at the Great West Hotel. Adam had driven down and walked the area, hiking into the woods and trekking around the abandoned warehouses in that part of town. No bodies. No mutilated animals. No vampire. But searching for one beast led him on the tail of another, which brought him to the Jasperton Cemetery at midnight on a Thursday. All the signs, 2 torn-up raccoons, busted windows on a family crypt, and a lack of any other wildlife pointed to a fresh ghoul. It was late enough that he was the only person in the cemetery. At least that was what he thought, until he heard footsteps heading toward him. Suspecting that it was a security guard, he ducked behind a tall obelisk just off the gravel path. A moment later, his senses told him that it wasn't a security guard. It was Gold. He knew he should leave. She had to be back in fighting form by now and had no reason to give him the time of day, well, night, to be exact. But Adam couldn't help himself. The urge to see her, to speak with her, overrode his hard-earned sense of self-preservation. He stepped out onto the path. Gold stopped and looked him up and down, smirking. "Did you come to hang out with people your own age?" She wore dark jeans and a dark top covered with a leather jacket. In her hand she held that wicked-edged silver knife that she'd had at his house. Her blonde hair was held back in a tight braid. A warrior princess. Adam grinned and nodded down the path. "I've got a poker game with an old bag of bones in a crypt down the way." A laugh escaped, but she cut it short. "What are you doing here, Adam?" She'd never called him by his first name before. He just kept grinning. Maybe they weren't on the verge of bloodshed, after all. He shrugged and answered. "Same as you, I think." She was good at her job and had probably tracked the ghoul as well. She gave her head a little shake and started down the path. Adam went with her, expecting her to try and stop him, but she said nothing. She looked good in the moonlight. Her movements were smooth, unhampered by the injury she'd recovered from. He wanted to ask how she was doing, but he worried that if he spoke, she'd tell him to piss off. He couldn't have that. So they walked in silence. It was a large cemetery, used by most of the people who lived out their lives and died in the Jasperton area. Some of the gravestones had dates reaching all the way back to the town's founding in 1824, though they were all clustered in a gated area near the entrance. He and Gold walked through a newer area, the gravestones only going back 20 years or so. Trees and saplings formed neat lines between the rows of graves, and every 30 yards or so, there was a monument or family crypt. The cemetery had spread out like a city, naturally growing as more and more citizens died. At night it was peaceful, if not for the threat of the stalking ghoul. An owl hooted, but Adam reacted to the sound on instinct, stepping close to Gold and putting his hands up, ready to fight. She jumped into action, her knife held high, back to his, trusting him to shield her from threats coming from behind. Realizing what it was, they both stepped back, keeping a healthy distance between themselves. They walked on in silence, not mentioning the defensive posture. Several more minutes passed with nothing but the sound of their footsteps and breathing. Adam was coming to realize that if the ghoul had ever been here, it had moved on for the night. "I already read it," Gold said out of nowhere once they came to a stop, her eyes scanning the edge of the cemetery. They'd reached the hedge that acted as the northern fence of the property. No ghouls, no vandals, no vampires. Except him, of course. The Art of War? Even he wasn't sure why he'd given her both books. Or why he'd written the note. They'd reached a nice clearing between graves, only a crypt off the path offering cover in a fight. He wanted to taste her, but he didn't want to hurt her. No. She took a deep breath and said, "Pride and Prejudice." Adam barely breathed as he walked over to her. He wanted to reach out and cup her face in his hands, lean in, and taste her lips. They were connected somehow, through the marks on their flesh and through their battles. He wanted them connected in body as well. "Have you fed on anyone since?" She trailed off, not quite looking at him while she asked the question. Her voice was so low that if he hadn't been a vampire, he doubted that he could have heard her. Why? She knew he was a vampire, knew he had to feed. That he hadn't been able to think of feeding on anyone but her was beside the point. She held her hand up but then pulled it back and grabbed onto her opposite elbow. "Because I can't just let a vampire go around eating people." She threw up the arm she'd been moving. "It's not right. What do you suggest? That I drink only from you?" He meant it in jest, more or less. Gold put her knife back into its sheath, silently admitting that they were no longer on a hunt. And that she wouldn't hurt him. "What's it like?" She tried to sound casual. "What?" Adam could have tripped on a pebble at that moment. He'd been sure that they were playing a game, that his feelings could never, be reciprocated. He hadn't really let himself believe that she might be struggling with the same attraction. "I've been having these." "Whatever." She trailed off again, giving up on trying to explain. "I don't know." "Never mind." He'd been given his inch, and he wasn't letting it go. "I can give you a taste. Just a sip." Adam took her hand and brought her knuckles up to his mouth. He brushed his lips against her warm skin, his fingers sliding down until he felt her racing pulse. He could see the dark lines of the mark on her skin creeping out from the sleeve of her shirt. "I'm sure that's what you tell all the girls." She tried to sound flippant, but there was a catch in her voice. "It will feel good, I promise." He'd had centuries to perfect bringing pleasure to his lovers. A feed, to be truly enjoyable, needed to be a decadent experience for the woman he took. When done right, it was more intimate than sex. "You're the only person I've wanted since we met." The thought of drinking from another woman repulsed him. Gold was the focal point of all of his desires. Gold flipped her hand over, clasping his hand. She pulled him off the path and pushed him down onto the stone bench beside one of the crypts. They were already alone in the cemetery, but now they were also out of sight if anyone did walk by. "Do it before I change my mind," she said it quickly, but her eyes were bright with fear and excitement. Anticipation. This was not how he'd expected the night to go. To taste gold, straight from her veins, to have her offer herself up to him. This felt too real to be a dream, but it was almost impossible to believe that it was reality. She was staring down at where their hands were intertwined. Adam flipped her palm up and stroked his thumb against the faint veins beneath her skin. Her fingers curled in instinctively. This wasn't just about blood. He looked up at her and reached over with his other hand to tilt her head up by her chin. A million words raced through his mind, warring for what to say to her. She could get scared at any moment, so he had to make this good for her. He had to be worth it. And yet, he'd give up the taste of her blood for just one kiss. Those dreams had turned him into a maudlin fool. He'd survived for centuries by acting quickly and taking what he needed, ignoring what he wanted until he was sure he'd survive. Screw survival. Adam leaned forward and swiped his lips against hers, tasting the chemical berry flavor of her lip gloss and the alluring feminine flavor of her underneath. Her mouth opened under him, tongue cautiously peeking out, taking her time to savor him. He felt her hands bury themselves in his hair, casually undoing the tie he'd used to hold it back, and Adam groaned, pulling her close. She was soft against him, her chest flush against his. This was life, this was why he'd sought her out. Kissing her in the flesh was so unbelievably better than it had been in the dream. How had he ever mistaken that for pleasure? Already he was hard for her. He couldn't explain this hunger. It was tied up with his need for blood and yet separate at the same time. He kissed along her chin and down her neck, taking his time to taste every inch of her that was bare to the night. Adam nipped at the pulse in her throat, almost able to taste the hot blood pumping. Gold pushed against his chest and he pulled back, afraid that he'd gone too far. Instead, she offered him her wrist. "Here," she said. "I can't cover up my neck as easily." When she said that, he perversely wanted to bite her throat and mark her as his. But he took her hand and kissed the pulse there, rolling up his eyes. "As you wish, love." The endearment slipped out and Adam's own heart swelled. It wasn't true. Not right now, not yet. He only knew the idea of her, only knew what she'd shown him. But if they kept this up, he'd fall over the cliff and never try to climb back up. No, if they kept this up, he'd dive off that cliff head first. Adam traced the dark lines of the mark around her wrist with his tongue and she gasped. He still didn't understand what it was, how it connected them, but on her it was beautiful. Then in a flash he broke her skin and her blood flowed. It was pure lightning, red energy beating through her body, pumped by her heart. Her blood was the best, most powerful thing he'd ever tasted. Electricity flashed behind his eyes, turning everything white and blanking out the rest of his senses. There was only gold. It was like the dreams again, but this time he could truly taste her. A connection bloomed between them, the branches of the mark on his own arm climbing across his vision until they merged with hers. An impossible knowing overtook him. He had no other way to describe it. He could see into Gold's soul, see the goodness, and those few specks of darkness, that made her who she was. She shined with the bright light of the sun, fierce in her purpose, bright enough to burn him to cinders. Instead, he basked, the light not blinding, but warm and comforting, enveloping him completely. This knowing didn't give him facts. He didn't know her birthday or the name of her third-grade teacher or any of the millions of details that made her who she was. It gave him truth. He'd been certain he wasn't in love with her, but now her heart beat in time with his own and he couldn't be sure. The world fell away and then it was just the two of them. They were no longer sitting on a bench in the Jasperton cemetery. Adam no longer had his teeth buried in Gold's wrist. They stood in a forest of barren birch trees, white trunks growing high up around them, empty branches and a naked canopy above. A blanket of fresh leaves crinkled beneath his feet. "What is this place?" asked Gold. She stepped close to him and Adam grabbed her hand, keeping her close. "I'm not doing this." He was speaking to her in this vision, but was vacantly aware that they were also still back in Jasperton. "This is where it ends." The words echoed around them, bouncing off the trees. It was an eerie, ghost-like voice. Gold's fingers squeezed his tight. And then the vision dissolved and Adam was back on the hard bench with Gold practically sitting in his lap, her wrist held tightly to his face. He pulled back, reaching into his pocket and grabbing a handkerchief. Adam wrapped his fingers against her wrist. "It will stop bleeding soon," he said. Gold placed one of her hands on top of his own. "We've got time." She leaned in and kissed him again. The taste of her mouth mixed with the taste of her blood, and desire roared inside Adam. It was impossible, but he was absolutely certain that if he took her right now, he'd empty himself inside of her, bringing pleasure to them both. Her blood was so powerful, the strange bond between them so firm, she was returning this lost bit of his humanity to him. Adam wanted it, wanted her. He wanted to take her to his home and lay her down in his bed and bring her to pleasure until the sun set again. Desire and love mixed up with confusion at what they'd just experienced. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And so Adam pulled back, setting her hand down gently and tying his handkerchief around her wrist. She looked at him, brow furrowed, the crease between her blue eyes deep with confusion. Adam leaned forward and kissed it, unable to help himself. "I need to go," he said. He was in too deep already. Chapter 13. Gold walked up the stairs to her room in a daze. Her wrist throbbed where Adam had given his bite and the checkered handkerchief tied was another reminder of what they'd just done. It had been so sensual, far more than she could have predicted. Gold knew that it was pleasurable for the vampire, but she never would have expected how good it felt for her. It had been a betrayal of everything that she was. Shame assaulted her. She'd asked him to bite her. A vampire. Not only that, a vampire whose mark she bore on her wrist. A mark that was slowly crawling up her arm, vines stretching all the way to her elbow now. She was supposed to kill Adam, not lay herself out before him like a tasty meal. And now she had no idea how she was supposed to do that. Not now that she knew him so completely. Perhaps a stronger, more dedicated huntress could do it. One who knew how to push aside all desire, all emotion to get the job done. But that wasn't Gold. Adam wasn't evil. There was darkness within him, but his goodness warred with it, and it was winning. The bond that blossomed between them had showed it all to her. He hadn't always been a good man. If one of her ancestors had met him, he would have deserved everything he got. But he was honest now. Worthy. How was it right to kill him? She locked the door behind her when she entered the room and leaned against it, holding up her arm to study the twisting, dark vines. Why him? Why her? The lines on her arm didn't give her an answer. Her heart hurt when she thought of doing any harm to him. She wanted to chase him down right now and finish what they'd started. How would it feel to crawl into bed with him and not leave until morning? She'd never wanted a man as much as she wanted him. Rumor had it that vampires couldn't take pleasure like humans did, but she'd felt the hard length of him pressed up against her. He'd been just as aroused as she was. She was almost grateful for the prospect of sleep. She hadn't gone one night during the past weeks without dreaming of him. Did he have the dreams as well? It hadn't occurred to her that he might. Thoughts of dreams led to thoughts of that strange vision and the voice she'd heard. What end? Adam's death? Her own? The mad vampire O'Connell's? Or something else entirely? Adam had been right there with her, the bond between them both psychic and physical. She'd ask him in her dream, she resolved. Perhaps it wouldn't settle the matter immediately, but if she told her dream lover something and then asked Adam about it the next time she saw him, that would answer it. She was going to see him again. It wasn't even a question. For one, they had a mad vampire to hunt down. Without her mom or her aunts at home, she was in dire need of help. She couldn't keep the town safe from O'Connell if he resurfaced. She was good, but it took planning and a lot of firepower to take down a vampire. There was a reason that so few marked women survived. It was practically suicide to face a vampire alone. Gold would begin to deal with it in the morning. It was nearing 4 a.m. and she was in no state to go back out hunting. Not at the moment. First she untied the handkerchief around her wrist and threw it into a sink full of cold water. Then she took a shower and changed into her pajamas. A bruise was beginning to form around the two tiny welts right next to her pulse. In the morning she'd need to cover it along with the mark. She washed off Adam's handkerchief and wrung it out. Luckily, she hadn't bled much and the stains came right out, pink rivulets of water washing over her fingers. She hung the cloth on her towel rack to dry. Then she crawled into bed, ready to sleep until sunset. Instead she was woken by bright rays of light shining through her window and someone bumbling around, making lots of noise. Gold cracked open an eye, her covers pulled up over her head. It was her mom. Her mom who was supposed to be hunting zombies in Michigan. The mark on Gold's skin practically burned and she curled her hand under another layer of her sheets to keep it hidden. She wasn't ready to talk about it yet. "What are you doing here, Mom?" Gold mumbled, her voice getting clearer as she kept talking. "You're supposed to be on a hunt." Her mom set a tray down at the foot of her bed, careful to avoid Gold's legs. She smoothed down an errant lock of Gold's hair and kissed her forehead. "Lily called me. She said you were hurt." Caroline Jones was just under 50, her hair still lustrous and tawny. She wore her years well, but they'd taken their toll, as evidenced by the nasty scar that marked her forehead and the other little nicks and cuts on her arms and hands. They were the scars borne by every hunter. Gold was just beginning to accumulate the war wounds that marked her as a member of a select class. Gold had told Lily not to call. Of course her sister hadn't listened. "I told her it was fine. I can handle it." Gold clenched her fist under the blankets while she lied. Her mom paced, throwing her hands up while she spoke urgently. A vampire? You're smarter than that, Gold. You can't get worried just because Lily panics. Gold sat up a little, careful to keep her right hand hidden. She wasn't going to have this conversation while lying down. Caroline sat down beside her, pushing on Gold until she moved over enough to give her room. She reached for the tray and handed Gold a glass of orange juice. Gold grabbed for it a little awkwardly with her left hand. I worry because you're my kid, she said. Now drink up and we'll talk about your vampire problem. Gold sipped the juice. Thanks for breakfast. Below the consternation at her sister rested relief. Gold had questions. She wasn't quite ready to ask them yet, but her mom would know the answers to at least some of them. Caroline reached over to pull the covers down. Lily said you injured your chest. How does it look? Gold reached with her right hand to fend her off, trying to keep her personal space personal. She realized her mistake a second too late. Her mom gasped when she saw the mark climbing up Gold's arm and the bruise accompanying it. When did this happen? She demanded. Gold set her juice on the bedside table and let her head fall back against the headboard. I'm dealing with it, Mom. So let me deal. This was the problem with living at home at 25. Parents didn't understand when their kids grew up. You should have told me the moment this happened. Her mom grabbed her hand, yanking the rest of Gold with it. I know that you need to hunt down this monster alone, but that doesn't mean I won't help you plan. This is the most dangerous thing you'll ever be tasked with. She spoke with fury, her grip on Gold's arm fierce and more than a little painful. Mom, Gold tried to pull her arm back. When did this happen? Her mom looked up, angry blue eyes piercing her to the bed. There was no use arguing with a harsh look on Caroline Jones's face. Gold surrendered and admitted, like 2 weeks ago? I think. She couldn't remember the exact day, but it hadn't been long after her mom left town. Marigold Abigail Jones. Oh no, all 3 names. She was in trouble. How could you keep this from me? Don't you understand how? I can't believe you're. Her mother sputtered, unable to complete a sentence. I said I could handle it, Gold insisted. She finally wrenched her hand back and shoved both her arms under her covers, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Do you have a death wish? Her mom snapped. She stood up and bent over the bed, getting right in Gold's face. What? She was only starting to live, only starting to figure out the possibilities. Of course she didn't want to die. You can't leave the mark to fester. What are you talking about? The legends about Jones women and vampire marks went back centuries, but the details were always a bit hazy. She'd never heard about festering marks. Only death. Her mom's face softened, shoulders sagging. It'll kill you, baby, she said, voice full of pain. If you don't purify the leech who marked you before the mark reaches your heart, you're going to die. Her mom started pacing again. I need to check the texts. Eat your food, then meet me downstairs. We've got work to do. She swiped a kiss against Gold's forehead and then was gone, leaving Gold reeling where she sat. Gold pulled her hands out from under the covers again and studied the mark. Adam's bite was still there, though her mother hadn't noticed it, the bruise blossoming into an explosion of blue and purple. She hadn't dreamed of him last night. She needed to see him, needed to figure this out. Was it true? That if she didn't kill him, she would die? How could that be? And how could she bring herself to kill the man she was falling in love with? Chapter 14. 3 days. Adam spent as many centuries biding his time, knowing patience was the strongest tool in a vampire's arsenal. But he had not seen Gold in 3 days, and it was driving him up the wall. That could have also been her blood in his veins. With the energy she'd given him, he could have run around the world in the space of a night and still had time to dance a reel before sunrise. He hadn't even taken enough from her to make her dizzy. Back in his dark days, when he'd had no remorse, no pity for those weaker than him, back when he'd drained the life completely from his victims, he hadn't drank down as much power. This madness he carried for gold was nothing like the madness that had nipped at his heels in those days. It was nothing like the madness to which Richard O'Connell had succumbed. Adam didn't want to take his mind off her, but he needed to do something. Wandering the streets of Jasperton in hopes that he would stumble into her was only something he could do for 2 nights. If it went on beyond that, he'd be forced to admit that he had a problem. Had he ever pined for a woman like this? When he'd been turned, after a particularly vicious brawl outside a London pub, he'd had no wife and few prospects. Women had paid him for his bed sport at times and he'd happily taken the coin, the thought of an honest day's labor anathema. But back then, there'd been no one special. No one to love. He'd had vampiric companions, but those relationships never satisfied. It was all about death and territory. With gold, it was pure. Confusing as hell, but pure. Unwilling to go to the bookshop and unable to stalk the streets like a lovesick bastard, Adam put on his hunting clothes and headed out down Route 30 to the Great West Hotel. There was a vampire to hunt. O'Connell hadn't surfaced in the nearly 2 weeks since he'd gone mad. Adam had received word that Wendy Choi had made a miraculous recovery and had hightailed it back to Chicago at the first opportunity. Out of Jasperton, she was probably safe. A mad vampire might latch onto a scent and hunt its owner down, but it was early days yet for O'Connell and all he would be able to focus on was the hunger and pain of madness. His survival instinct would trump all else for some time. But just because he hadn't been seen didn't mean there wouldn't be clues at his last known location. Adam pulled into the cracked parking lot, the wheels of his vehicle fighting the potholes and ruptures in the abandoned pavement. He heard crickets chirping and owls hooting in the distance, but there was no sound of the squatters who had once made this place home. They'd been scared away by a monster and it would take some time for them to wander back. The inside of the hotel hadn't been touched by humans since he'd fled with gold. He saw the hole in the half-wall balcony on the 2nd floor where he and O'Connell had plunged through. The stairs were sagging and still smelled of rot. This was a hopeless place of misery. Better to tear it down and be done with it. Adam made his way up to the room where O'Connell had kept Wendy prisoner. The smell of stale blood and urine assailed him. He regretted entering as soon as he did. There was nothing new to learn here, just vicarious suffering. He heard someone kick over a piece of broken furniture and start to climb the stairs. There was only one intact staircase that led down from the 2nd floor, and he was not keen on jumping out the window. He ducked into the room beside the one where Wendy had been kept, staying out of sight. "I'll check upstairs, you scan outside." "I doubt he's here." The voice was muffled by the broken walls between them, but he'd recognize Gold anywhere. Adam stayed where he was, though, just in case Gold wasn't alone when she walked upstairs. He doubted she was ready to introduce him to her other hunter friends just yet. She stepped into the room where he'd been just a moment ago and he heard her come to an abrupt stop. He could barely make out her form through a sliver of a crack in one of the walls. She looked around, brow furrowed. "Adam?" She sounded truly puzzled. She was alone. He stepped through the remnants of a doorway back into the room with her and gave a little wave and a sheepish smile. "Hi," he said. "I couldn't." She trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" He'd never been more grateful for his enhanced vampiric vision. The only light in the hotel came from a street lamp outside of the broken windows and the moon shining through the cracked ceiling. If he were human, he wouldn't be able to make out the way her lips pulled a little to the right every time she looked at him, caught on the first second of a smile. He wouldn't see the hardened warrior's gaze in her blue eyes, compassion for O'Connell's victim and sheer determination to do her justice a bright light of fury. She shook her head a little. "Nothing, it's just strange." The entire weight of the last few weeks seemed to be resting on her shoulders and Adam didn't know how he could help. He took a step forward, arms outspread to hug her, but she held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. "You can't be here right now," she snapped. "Is everything all right?" The curiosity and wonder from a few nights ago was gone, but Adam could sense that this wasn't a rejection. She was holding something back, but she hadn't closed herself off to him. If she had resolved to be done with him, he would have seen steel in her eyes and a knife in her hand. She reached out and grabbed his hand, holding it like it anchored her. Can we talk later? She looked around wildly, refusing to meet his gaze. I'll come to you before sunup. Alarm bells rang in his head. Something was seriously wrong. Adam took another step closer to her and stooped down a little, trying to get a good look at her. Gold, I'm here, he said. Let me help you. Her head snapped up and she dropped his hand. Adam braced for rejection, but she clamped both hands on his face and dragged him down, kissing him like she was a drowning woman and he had the last air on earth. Adam wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flesh against his body. Her taste, her scent, it was like coming home, even in this damned hellhole. After a desperate moment, Gold pulled back, sucking down breaths and eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm not the only hunter here right now. You need to go. I'll come to the store later. She spoke so fast that it was an effort to keep up with her words. Another hunter. Of course. He'd heard, but he hadn't realized that she would be worried. She couldn't let her friend see her in the arms of a vampire. No wonder she was panicking. No, come to my house. He gave her his address without hesitation. They'd have more privacy there, and his bed, though he could only pray like a damned man that she joined him and discovered what the connection between them made him capable of. Gold pressed her hands against his chest, slapping it lightly in reproach. You shouldn't tell me where you live. I'm not. Adam swallowed the protest with a brief kiss. Yes, you are. I trust you, Gold. He would keep no secrets from her, not like this. He could not make her his if he was not completely hers. Still, he reassured her before stepping back. I won't hurt your friend on my way out. Gold's thunderstruck gaze met his, solemn certainty in her eyes. I know. Chapter 15. Sickness burbled in Gold's stomach as her SUV rolled down the back country road to the address that Adam had given her. The address that she wished Adam hadn't given her. Didn't he realize what she was? Or did he just not care? The thought that he told her out of a misguided sense of trust haunted her. She didn't deserve his trust. She was going to kill him. It had been a persistent ache in her chest for the 3 days since her mom told her the consequences of the mark. They'd spent that time researching what her ancestresses had done in these situations. None of the stories ended happily. But at least some of them ended with the huntress alive. Gold hadn't been careful, or maybe she wanted to be found out. It had slipped out that Adam owned the bookstore, and then again that she'd seen him more than once. That she'd talked to him. She'd held the secret of their kisses buried deep in her heart. And that she'd let him take her blood? She'd die before she admitted it. Not out of shame, that had passed. In its own way it had been beautiful, an expression of something that she wanted to grow between them. Now there would only be death. In a fit of melancholy while staring at the mark, the growth of which seemed to lessen now that she'd found her resolve, she'd asked if there were any accounts where both marked parties had survived. Her mom had gone pale with fury and fear and told her to not even think of it. Adam Luther had to die for her to live. That was that. She pulled up to the quaint ranch home just after 3 a.m. The brick would be a fizzy orange in the daylight, inviting and friendly. Hardly the domain of a creature of the night. Gold parked the SUV, but she didn't get out of her seat. She considered starting the car back up and just driving away, leaving Jasperton, leaving Illinois, and just finding some place where she'd be left alone. The mark would eventually kill her, but who knew how long it would take? And at least then Adam could live his life. No. She had a duty. She had a family to protect. Driving away was giving up. If she couldn't do this, she didn't deserve to be a Jones. She had to go down fighting. Absently, she wiped away the tear that had fallen down one cheek. She could cry later, once it was done. She'd be a murderer. She'd be unclean, undeserving of love ever again, but she would still be a huntress. Heart of heart and dedicated to what she was. Gold pulled the keys out of the ignition and got out of the car. The walk up the short flight of stairs and around the concrete porch felt like a marathon, but she raised her hand and knocked 3 times. It was time. The sound of her fist on the wood echoed through her ears and out into the night, as loud as a gong. A minute later, she heard the door being unlocked. It swung open and Adam stood there. He wore faded jeans and a black t-shirt, more casual clothing than she'd ever seen him in. A glance down at his feet showed her that he wasn't wearing shoes. He looked comfortable, at home. And when he saw her standing there, he beamed. It was a knife through Gold's heart. "You came," he said, pulling her inside with a gentle tug of her arm. "I'm sorry it's late." She was ashamed of the small stutter. She needed to be in complete control for when this went bad. As soon as she made this violent, he'd defend himself. He'd have to. "Not for me." His voice was so soft. He had no idea why she'd come. They were standing too close. His hand still rested on her forearm, and she felt the weight of his palm through her shirt. She stepped back and began to look around, trying to seem natural, at ease. "This isn't what I expected," she said. The house could have belonged to any human family. The front door opened right into a living room where he had a comfortable-looking dark couch set up across from a large television. A cherrywood bookshelf full of weighty tomes was flush against the wall next to a window. Adam looked around and shrugged. "I was going to go with a skulls theme, but the craft store was out of supplies." She didn't mean to smile, but she couldn't help it. Even when she was about to betray him, Adam put her at ease. "Yeah, but this place looks like my uncle's house." "It's so." He waved his hand around and explained. "This is just window dressing. Come downstairs and see the real home." He reached out for her hand. She pulled away before he could touch her. Every second she wasted felt 1 second closer to surrender. She needed to do the deed and be done with it. "We don't have a lot of time. It's hours yet until sunrise." He leaned in close, his head bowed over hers, but Gold ducked away. "What's wrong?" She wanted to grab him and kiss him until tomorrow. Maybe that would break this curse they'd both been unwittingly caught up in. But this wasn't a fairy tale. "I'd like to see your home." She didn't want to, not now, not when it was certain to star in her nightmares until she gasped out her dying breath. The walls were closing in around her and her holster felt like a boulder hanging down from her shoulder. With every step she moved through molasses, slow and hot, burning away her resolve. Adam took her hand and she squeezed it tight, following his lead down a steep flight of stairs behind a small but modern kitchen. He didn't turn on the light, and it was too dark for her to see. But Gold trusted him to lead her safely. At the bottom of the stairs, Adam flipped a switch and illuminated the basement in a flood of yellow light. It wasn't quite sun-bright, but for a man who couldn't journey into daylight, it was as close as he could hope to come. Adam ducked into the small bar area near the stairs. "I don't have much in the way of refreshments," he said with a small sorry smile. "Would you like water? I think I've got some wine down here." He crouched down out of view and she heard glasses clinking together as he searched. The lump in her throat was big enough to choke on and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from gasping out a harsh cry. She thought of Lily, who was about to finish her sophomore year of high school and had barely begun to learn how to be a huntress. Her mom's form rose up in her mind. Caroline Jones wouldn't hesitate for a second, not if it meant protecting her kids. But right now this was Gold's task: purify the world of a vampire and protect her family. She reached into her jacket and silently pulled her gun out of its holster. She clicked off the safety and almost flinched. Hyper-focused on her own actions, it sounded like an explosion. Adam heard it too, but by the time he stood, her weapon was already pointed at the center of his chest. He held a dark green bottle of wine and set it down on the counter before slowly raising his hands. "Gold?" he asked, confused. His face resolved into shock after a second and his eyes darted between the dark barrel of the gun and her own face. He swallowed hard and his fingers shook where they were held up by his head. He should have been charging her, trying to rip her throat out. He should have been trying to defend his own life, not standing there like some innocent victim. But mostly, he shouldn't have looked hurt. She tried to harden herself, tried to keep herself firm, but it was like holding a door against the torrent of a tsunami. How many people have you killed? She spat it out, emotions be damned. Adam took a step around the bar and moved toward her slowly. No, she yelled. Stay right there. Her gun wavered. Adam froze. When he spoke, his words were ice, not like the man she'd come to know. It's more than enough to deserve every bullet you've got. Twice over. There was her reason, right there. Another one to add to the pile of good reasons. It didn't make it easier, nor did it harden her resolve. The trigger felt like a knife under her finger. One of us has to die. That's what the mark means. I thought it was only showing me my path. But there's a cost. There's always a cost. She needed him to understand why she was doing this. But did she have the right to kill him, just so that she could live? If she did it, didn't that make her just as bad as the vampires who killed their prey? His shoulders sagged. Then shoot me. Chapter 16. Gold shattered, the tsunami rushing over her, flooding her with a torrent of emotion she couldn't ignore. With shaking hands, she flipped the safety back on and slid the gun back into her holster, securing it blindly. I can't. Her voice cracked and a hiccuping sob racked her. She closed her eyes to shut out the tears, but it was no use. When Adam's arms came around her, she buried her head in the crook of his neck and breathed in the now all too familiar scent. Lemon and moss and something almost spicy. Completely unique to him. No one would ever reproduce it. She babbled, not really explaining, but just letting the words pour out. I can't even pretend that I can do it. Not you, it's all in here. She thumped her fist against her chest so hard that she almost coughed. Like it's exploding and cracking and reforming and you're right there at the center of it. She clung to him, unable to get close enough. If she was going to die, let it be with him. Love. Adam kissed the top of her head and pulled back just enough so that he could look at her. His face was blurry through her tears, but he wiped the wet tracks away with a broad brush of his thumb. It's taken me 343 years. Don't you think I recognize the real thing when it's right in front of me? She dug her hands into the back of his shirt, stretching it beyond repair and reaching up, capturing his lips with hers, tearing into him with ferocious passion. There was nothing gentle here, it was feral, all of her frustration and longing, her fear and her desire channeled through her lips, a current running straight from her body and into his. Adam's hands found the lapels of her jacket, pushing it off until it bunched and caught at her elbows. She flung her arms back, twisting, trying to get it off. That small action gave her a second, let her breathe. She placed her hand on his chest and pulled back, giving herself a little space. She moved to stand, but Adam's hand landed on her wrist, not forcing her to stay still, but stopping her all the same. You're thinking, he warned. He was truly a beautiful man, with a mouth made for sin and kind eyes. Some would call them hard, but she'd seen into his soul. She knew who he was now. A man who was worth everything. He tugged on her arm, a request. Gold could have pulled back, but she sunk back down next to him. Adam kissed each of her eyebrows and then her nose before leaning his forehead against hers. Let me do the thinking for just a little while. I'm scared. Terrified, as a matter of fact. Every thought piled onto the ones before it, a traffic jam in her brain. She had no idea where to go from here, no thought for what to do come morning. The only sure, stubborn thing in her was her need for Adam. The rest of the world could have ended, and he would still be her North Star. He reached for her braid and untangled the tie at the end, letting the strands come undone. I'm scarier than any of your demons, he promised. Just let me be yours. Yes. He kissed her and it was like coming home out of the cold on a dark winter's night. She breathed him in, body pressed tight against him, unwilling to let even an inch of space come between them. She tried to move, but her arms got caught up in her jacket. Gold jerked her shoulders, letting it fall off while trying to keep in contact with him. She felt Adam smile against her and his hands reached around to help ease off the jacket. Her holster bumped against her chest, an unwelcome reminder of why she'd come. Gold reached down to undo the clasp on her chest and tore the holster off. She flung the leather straps far away, not wanting to think about violence anymore. Adam was with her, here and now, safe and all hers. His muscles were taut against her body and the masculine scent of him enveloped her. She wanted to roll around in it until she'd never be able to forget it. His hands caught her sides, holding her upright. Gold could feel that contact all the way to her toes. Adam kissed along her jaw and down the side of her neck. His teeth scratched at the thick vein there and she arched up, moaning. But he didn't bite her. Any disappointment was washed away when his hands bunched beneath her shirt and started to inch it up. And then he stopped and pulled back. No, this is wrong. It was a wave of ice water on Gold's lust. What? She was desperate with want. One touch and she was sure she'd explode. But Adam's dark eyes met hers and she saw it wasn't a rejection. No man could look at a woman with that naked hunger on his face and push her away. I want you in my bed. Oh. Yes. She wanted that too. Tell me you need me. I do. The declaration was desperate and primal. Right now. And she wanted this past tomorrow and past next week. Adam had taken a place in her heart, filling a hole she didn't know was there. If something happened to him, she'd take on the world to stop it. Was this love? With lust riding her hard, all she knew was Adam, all she wanted was Adam. Slowly, Adam kissed his way up, pulling her tight against him, his knee wedging between her legs. You taste better than blood, he said in awe. Some last thread of tension within her snapped and Gold laughed, pressing a hand against his chest. That should not sound romantic. And yet an entirely different kind of pleasure curled in her heart. Adam's chest rose and fell with a little laugh. You know I'm not done with you. She hoped that was a promise. Chapter 17. When it was done and all the pleasure and more had been wrung out of Gold, she cuddled up to Adam, her hand curled possessively over his heart. There was a pleasant ache in her thigh where he'd taken her blood, and she still tingled with the aftermath of their shared lovemaking. She'd heard it once said that vampire's flesh was as cold as the dead, but he was warm and very much alive right next to her. I'm sorry for trying to kill you, she said. Adam burst out laughing, the sound filling the room, his lungs expanding beneath her fingers. If this is the outcome, I welcome as many death threats as you'll give me. He picked up her arm and held it near his own, the mirrored marks shining. It doesn't seem very deadly. She'd studied it a dozen times already, the cracked, twisting lines practically burned into her eyeballs. But he was right. When she didn't hold the mark next to his, it seemed like a normal, if a bit overdone, tattoo. She reached out a finger and stroked from one end to the other. You'd think it would hurt. We can find a way to stop this. He rolled onto his side so that he faced her completely. Gold looked into his dark eyes and tried to discern if he really believed that. You can't fight fate. Not the kind that killed a woman for refusing to kill the man she loved. People have spent centuries, millennia, arguing quite the opposite, love. When he called her love, his voice lilted up, the accent of his human years sneaking through. Something niggled at the back of Gold's mind. I have a question, and I'm not sure I want the answer. Adam's eyes sparked and he grinned, sweeping a kiss across her forehead. Go on. In my research. She almost shuddered remembering the things she'd learned. Your victim pro, your Mo? Ugh, she shook her head, never mind. I can't ask. He grew grim, understanding what she meant. It was a war. The Civil War, he clarified. I was a right bastard before then. Not a care in the world except for fun. After that, I didn't reform then, not exactly. He shook his head, trying to put his thoughts in order. But the excesses of some of my brethren, I couldn't stand it. And so I hunted down the worst of them, letting their exploits stand as my own. I had a name to protect, after all. She wanted to press him for more, but now wasn't the time. God, he fascinated her? Who were you? She asked, before you were you? She reached up and pushed a lock of his hair out of his eyes. Adam grinned and kissed her palm before she pulled it away. Her own hair had to be a rat's nest now, tangled all around her shoulders and pouring over her breasts. There was a wistfulness in his voice when he answered. I wasn't anyone but a bit of a scoundrel. A whore at times. The failed son of a baker who would have ended up dead in an alley before 30 if I hadn't become what I became. His brow furrowed and he grinned. In fact, I was dying in an alley when he found me. Who? She didn't know how much time they had together, but she wanted every scrap of detail to take with her. Even the things she didn't want to know. Adam trailed a finger lazily up her shoulder and down her arm. Now that they'd shed their clothes, he couldn't seem to help himself, the casual caresses mounting. Gold loved it and understood the urge entirely. He was a lonely bloodsucker, too old for the world and looking for a companion. God only knows why he chose me. He gave a wry grin. Good thing he spared me the details, else I would have never agreed to it. You're not talking about murder, are you? The twinkle in his eye would never be raised by the specter of his sins. No, not that. But try telling a drunken, horny young man that he'll never find release in the willing arms of a beautiful woman again and see if he takes your offer of immortality. He pulled her forward and she felt the hard length of him pressed against her stomach. She yelped and laughed, then moaned as his lips closed on her neck, teeth barely scraping against the delicate skin. He was saving the fangs for later. You really haven't had sex in 300 years? She couldn't believe it. Not with the way he played her like a finely strung harp. Then how is this possible? Your blood? The mark? Love? Whatever it is, I'll savor it with you until my last breath. He held her against him so closely that she heard his heart beating. Even the suggestion of his breath ceasing hurt. Then she thought for a moment about what he just said. Wait, was that the mark, love, that you said? As in the endearment? This was one of the times she wished people spoke their commas out loud. He told her that he was hers, but neither of them had admitted the rest out loud. Adam's little laugh rumbled against her. He kissed her ear through the mass of hair. I wouldn't let just anyone kill me, love, he promised. Chapter 18. At nearly 5 in the morning, Adam's mind still reeled. He kept his arms hugged tightly around Gold as if she could disappear into dust if he gave her even an extra inch to breathe. But snuggled up against him and clinging to his arm, she seemed to have no complaints. In a perfect world, he'd stay here like this with her all day. And then all night and again through the entire weekend. But he'd be kind. He'd let her break for snacks. Gold stirred awake, her body consciously rubbing against his, reveling in the intimacy they now shared. Good morning, she mumbled. Adam's hands trailed over her stomach, the light caress raising the delicate hair on her arms. Good morning, he replied, brushing his lips against the space where her neck met her shoulders. Her phone, the one she'd bought to replace the one he'd stolen, lying somewhere in a pile of clothing strewn about the room, beeped with an incoming text message, an unwelcome intrusion from the outside world. Ignore it, Adam told her. They still had enough time to steal a few more moments. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so complete. If the entire rest of the world fell away, he would have no complaints. Gold was the only thing that mattered. I can't. She rolled out from under the covers and started picking through the clothing on the floor. They had not been neat in their haste. My mom is probably freaking out right now. I would have thought she'd be waiting outside with a tank by now, he joked. Knowing Gold's purpose for coming to him last night, it was startling that she didn't come with any backup. She stopped her search and looked over at him, solemn. I didn't tell her where you live. She bent back down and picked up her jacket, rooting through the pockets to find her phone. Then she hadn't expected to make it out of his house alive, even if she killed him. Maybe it hadn't been intentional, but there was no other reason for keeping his address from her hunter friends. Even as this bond between them killed her, she was protecting him. It took Adam's breath away. Gold. But she wasn't looking at him. She pulled her phone out of the pocket of her pants and her face went white. I need to leave. Right now. Adam sat up from where he'd been laying on his side. What's wrong? Gold shook her head, fingers scraping against the bright screen. She didn't answer for a moment, as if it was impossible to find the words. When she could, she whispered, I don't know. Something bad. I'm going with you. It wasn't even a question. Whatever was in that text message was bad enough to stop her in her tracks. She needed help. It's almost sunrise, you can't. She was gathering up her clothes, slipping her pants back on and searching around for her bra. Adam found it right next to where he was sitting and tossed it toward her. He got out of bed and grabbed his own clothes. "I'm coming with you," he said again. Gold looked at him for a few seconds and then nodded. There was no more argument. They dressed quickly and Gold retrieved her weapons. Before they headed upstairs, she stepped close and hugged him tight. "Thank you." Adam squeezed her back, offering silent comfort. Then the moment passed and they were moving. Without discussion, they climbed into Gold's SUV and took off down the road, heading back toward town. After a mile or so, she turned off the highway onto one of the back roads. She reached into her pocket and handed over her phone. "Text her back." 3 happy emojis and then one with a dog. "A code?" "Sort of." Adam looked at the text box and saw that she'd been sent a series of random smiling yellow faces from her mom. There was no rhyme or reason to the symbols. "Does this mean something?" She shook her head, fingers tightening against the steering wheel and turning her knuckles white. "No, it's like she just smashed whatever she could." As instructed, Adam responded to the text. There was no reply. They rolled down the dark roads. Sunrise would be coming soon, quick and deadly, but there was nothing that Adam could do about it at the moment. Gold's mom wouldn't appreciate his presence. He couldn't ever remember meeting a lover's parents, but especially not under these tense circumstances. He wouldn't be wanted there, but if this emergency was because of O'Connell, then they just might need him. No matter what, the Joneses would get used to him. Because there was nothing that was going to keep him from Gold's side. A few minutes later, Gold pulled up to a well-lit, nicely landscaped farmhouse. A commuter never would have guessed that a band of demon hunters lived there, but the name Jones on the mailbox proclaimed that it was her family residence. She stopped the car and Adam could just make out that the front door hung open. The lights were off around the porch, but it was bright enough to see the shadow. He unbuckled his belt, but Gold put a hand on his chest to stop him from getting out of the car. "Wait," she said. She closed her eyes and breathed deep, her brow furrowing. "There's a vampire out back in the woods." "O'Connell." She sounded certain. "You can sense that?" She'd already demonstrated inhuman reflexes and a taste for danger. That she also possessed some minor psychic power didn't surprise him. She shrugged. "Most of the time." But she didn't explain the exceptions. They didn't have time. Adam opened the car door and smelled blood thick in the air. Human, with only the faintest trace of vampire. There'd been a fight and it hadn't gone well for the Joneses. Gold sensed it as well. She took off running toward the front door, and once they climbed the whitewood porch that wrapped around the house, Adam saw the thick, wet streaks of blood heading toward the entrance. Gold was a few steps ahead of him and crossed the threshold, gasping out at what she saw. A middle-aged woman sat against the back of a dark couch, a pool of blood getting thicker around her by the moment. Her face was lined with pain, but the resemblance to Gold was unmistakable. Her mother. Adam tried to step in to help, to do something, but he hadn't been invited. He was blocked at the threshold. Gold crouched at her mother's side, her hands hovering a few inches above her as if she were afraid that touching her would make the injuries worse. "What happened?" she asked. Her mother rolled her head toward Adam and betrayal flashed in her eyes when she sensed what he was. "You brought that." She was prevented from finishing the sentence by a racking cough. He could hear the blood in her lungs. Finally, Gold looked over at him and realized that he was stranded outside. "You may enter, Adam," she said, and the magical barrier in front of the door dissolved like cotton candy. "He's here to help. Now, tell me what happened." Emotion drained from her voice, replaced by harsh resolve. She was no longer a daughter worried for her mother, but a huntress on the job. That tone was enough to break Gold's mom out her hate-fueled staring contest. Her injuries were such that she could barely gasp out half sentences. "Charlie's in the panic room." "Lily gone." "Vamp took her." "One of the crazy ones." "The one we were looking for." Happened 20 minutes ago. Adam, call an ambulance. She didn't explain who Charlie and Lily were, but he figured they were other hunters, perhaps her other relatives. There was a phone lying beside Ms. Jones and Adam reached for it, having left his own at home in their haste. Don't. Her mum coughed out. Not until sunrise. The sirens'll attract it. Charlie'll help me. It, he knew, meant O'Connell. If they called for help, the paramedics would be at risk. It was 30 minutes until sunrise. Adam was intimately familiar with how much blood a human could lose and still survive. Ms. Jones was already nearing that limit. In 30 minutes, she'd be dead. He knew it, she knew it, and from the set of Gold's shoulder, she realized it as well. He crouched down beside Gold and placed his hand on the small of her back. Anything stronger than that small gesture of comfort would have to wait. Your sister's still alive, Ms. Jones rasped, the ambulance issue settled. Sure of it. Knows the woods. So Lily was Gold's sister, probably younger judging by Ms. Jones's age. We'll find her, Gold said. She leaned over her mother's form and kissed her forehead. I'll get Charlie. Then we'll find Lily. Just stay alive. She took off toward the back of the house, leaving Adam alone with Ms. Jones. He reached behind his head and pulled off his shirt by the collar, using it as a makeshift bandage. The wound was on her abdomen and had just missed her stomach. If she got care in time, she could survive. But Ms. Jones was past looking out for herself. You're going to kill her, she accused. There was little malice in her voice, though. She didn't have the strength anymore. Adam pressed his t-shirt lightly against her, trying to balance between helping and hurting. I won't let that happen. Gold was not going to die until she was at least 103 and surrounded by a bevy of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He couldn't allow anything else. Ms. Jones didn't have an answer for that. But a minute later, she started shaking, teeth chattering. It's cold. Shock. She didn't have much time now. Sunrise was still in 30 minutes. She only needed to make it long enough to get to the hospital. And kneeling in a puddle of her blood, the red staining his fingertips as it soaked through his shirt, he realized that he could help. If she would accept. I can buy you time. My blood. It wouldn't turn her, but vampire blood had healing properties. Just a sip and she'd make it. No. Won't. She couldn't get the full denial out without a drop of her own blood leaking out of her mouth. At this rate, she wouldn't be alive by the time that Gold made it back to them. Your daughter just damn near broke herself to please you, said Adam, the anger from what Gold had almost done bubbling up. He had no family, but he could remember what it had been like. And in the few minutes he'd seen Gold in front of her mom, he saw the devotion between them. They were close. Her mother's death would be a blow she couldn't deal with. Not right now. She loves you, he continued. You have a traumatized kid out there who's going to need you when we bring her back. If you think I'm going to let you hurt Gold like this because of your pride. Using what little strength she had, she reached out and grasped his arm, fingers falling across the mark on his arm. Promise me you'll take care of it. If she can't. It. Gold's life. His death. Will you let me help you? Some would call it a lopsided bargain, one where he was the only one slated to die, but Adam had made plenty of bad deals in his life. He was still breathing. Ms. Jones nodded. If you promise. Gold will be safe, he said. I'll keep her alive. At any cost. Even if he had to walk into the sun to do it. Adam ripped open a gash on his wrist and pressed it against Ms. Jones's mouth. Her face rippled in revulsion as his blood touched her tongue, but as the tangy spice of power washed over him, the revulsion faded into dark desperation. He only let her cling to him for a few seconds before pulling away. Already her color was returning and her breathing eased. He used his shirt to wipe away the ring of his blood that had been left around her mouth. He'd saved her life. Now it was time to save Gold's. Chapter 19. She'd come up from the stairs to see Adam crouching over her mother, pressing his shirt gently against the wound on her stomach. Charlie was right behind her, pale and shaking and convinced a hungry fleet of vampires was lined up right outside the door. That was the only thing that kept her from stumbling and sobbing. She had to be strong for him. Gold was never going to see her mother alive again. They wouldn't have time to fight and rage about her decision to be with Adam. The responsibility for training Lily would fall to her. And she'd barely had time to say goodbye. But there was no time to waste. Every second that Lily spent out in the woods was another moment that O'Connell could torture her. Gold was going to stop him. Then she would kill him and save her sister. At least one person was going to make it out of this night alive. She and Adam left Charlie beside her mom with strict instructions for him to call the ambulance 5 minutes before sunrise. They walked around the house and into the woods behind. The forest was dense and she could sense O'Connell's presence thick within the trees. It surrounded her, so fully saturating the land that she could not get a trace on where he lurked. The woods should have been alive with bugs and small animals, but the only thing that moved was the slight wind in the trees. The rapidly brightening sky gave her enough light to see by, but as her vision became clearer, her worry grew. "You should go back," she told Adam when they came to a clearing of birch trees. Pale light fell across the ground, delicate and deadly. "You can't get caught out here. The basement doesn't get any sun." It had been intended to save her relatives from vampires, not shelter one, but she'd make an exception. Adam shook his head and rubbed his hand absently down the opposite arm. It was chilly, but even without a t-shirt on, he didn't show it. "A few more minutes. It's not bad yet." She didn't waste time arguing. Every minute they wasted put both him and Lily at risk. She looked for any sign of a struggle. There was only one clear path through these woods. It led out to another farm after a few miles. Broken twigs and the occasional drop of blood told her they were moving in the right direction. But O'Connell had a long lead on them, and the only thing they could do was keep moving and hope to find him in time. Adam walked beside her and reached down to squeeze her hand. "I love you, Gold." She closed her eyes as even more emotion flooded her. She wanted to tell him the same thing, but with the stakes as they were, she couldn't force the words out. All she could say was, "Tell that to me tomorrow." He raised her hand to his lips and brushed a kiss against the back of her palm before dropping it and saying, "And every day until the end." She swallowed the lump in her throat. She wouldn't contemplate the end. Not yet. A bush beside the path had been completely flattened as if a body had fallen over it and rolled around. There was blood on the leaves. Adam took a sniff and met her eyes. "It's human. Lily." They were minutes from sunrise and still only tracking. Gold was about to tell Adam to leave when they heard a scream. All thoughts of sunrise momentarily forgotten, she took off running. That was Lily. Gold veered off the path and vaulted over a fallen log, branches from the leafy trees swatting at her as she moved toward the sound of her sister's voice. O'Connell's presence became even thicker, the woods feeling positively evil and imbued with the demon that dwelled within him. With a running jump, Gold hit the side of a ravine and slid down feet first. Bark scraped against her, cutting up her arms and tearing off a fingernail. She barely felt it. Adam was right behind her, jumping rather than sliding into the ravine and landing in a crouch. "Human blood in there," he said, nodding toward the cracked entrance to a cave. "I sense him." She'd never felt a vampire like this before. The evil surrounding her was thick enough to make her want to vomit. The entrance to the cave was nothing but a dark crack in the wall of the ravine. They'd be entering blind, and there was an enraged vampire inside who held her sister hostage. He could kill her before she crossed the threshold. Gold pulled out a sharpened stake. Her knife could do more damage, but it wouldn't kill a vampire. And Adam was a weapon unto himself. She and Adam pressed themselves up against either side of the narrow cave entrance. Thick tree roots had grown over the rock, making the door barely bigger than shoulder width. Adam pointed to himself and then the door, indicating that he'd go in first. He was the stronger one, the one who could take more damage. It was a smart move. Gold nodded. They moved in, Adam stepping first and Gold right behind him. It had been dark enough outside that there wasn't much of a shock to her system in the dim light of the cave, but sight was still minimal. Gold crouched down near the cave wall, making herself a smaller target while she looked around. Adam did the same. Her eyes found O'Connell almost immediately. He wasn't paying any attention to them, his entire being focused on a small corner of the cave. A corner where Lily's cries echoed out. She sounded terrified and angry as a spitfire, but she didn't sound injured. The vampire was in a worse state than she could have imagined. The night at the hotel he'd been wearing an expensive red shirt and dark slacks. He would not have been out of place in a boardroom or a nice restaurant. Now, 3 weeks later, those same clothes were stained with blood and other fluids. Gold caught sight of his hands in flashes as he worked to tear away at the wall beside Lily. It seemed that Lily had managed to wedge herself into a corner too small for him to reach. It was a last resort, but at the moment it was saving her sister's life. Gold's hand tightened on her stake as his hand flashed again. His fingers had curled in, nails having grown impossibly fast and thick, forming crude claws. He was a wild animal, all traces of humanity washed away in blood madness, his hunger having become the driving force of his being. She spared one more glance at Adam and they both nodded. O'Connell was not making it out of this cave alive. He'd mortally wounded her mother, tortured her sister, and now trapped the man she loved because there was no way for Adam to make it back to the house in time. Gold had never been more motivated. She gripped her stake tight and then called out, "I'm here, Lily. Just hold on." That got O'Connell's attention. He jerked around, his face covered in mud and blood, eyes wide, irises red, the white of his eyes black. There was no pretending he was anything but a monster. The second he stared at her seemed to drag on for hours, and then O'Connell was rushing, moving across the room in a blinding flash of speed. There was no technique to his attack, and Gold was ready to meet him head-on. She sunk to one knee and used his momentum against him, flipping him over with almost no effort, flopping with a resounding thud onto his back. But before she could stake him, he'd flipped himself back onto his feet. He took no time to steady himself, instead swiping at her with those wicked claws. They were dark with blood. Her mother's blood. She wanted to look over to check on Lily, but any distraction meant death. She was aware that Adam was somewhere near her, but the quarters were too close for both of them to take on the vampire at once. O'Connell got too close, his claws raking against her dominant arm. Gold bit back a cry of pain and punched out, hitting his throat and feeling the flesh give way. O'Connell stumbled back and she pressed her advantage, swiping across his cheek with her stake and drawing blood. But she got too confident. He grabbed her wrist, dragging it up to his mouth. Gold struggled, trying to pull it back. She was not letting him drink her blood. There was only one vampire in the world who got to do that. Her stake was in the hand he controlled, but it wasn't her only weapon. Unfortunately, if she reached for her knife, he'd bite her. They both fell sideways as Adam tackled O'Connell, breaking his grasp and freeing Gold. She scampered back and let the two men fight. She rushed over to the crevasse where Lily had barricaded herself. "Can you get out?" she asked her sister, trying to reach in to take her hand. The hole that Lily had found was barely a foot wide. It was amazing that she'd fit at all. "Is he dead?" Lily demanded. She didn't sound frightened anymore, but there was a core of steel telling Gold that the girl planned to remain hidden until it was completely safe. "It's after sunrise, the woods are safer than in here." That decided Lily. She grasped Gold's hand, but before Gold could pull her out, she was wrenched back into the fray, O'Connell turning his attention to her. She vaguely heard Lily yell after her, but her attention turned completely to the fight. They grappled, Gold trying to protect her blood while O'Connell went for any available vein. He wasn't even trying to fight her. He only wanted to feed. O'Connell flipped her over and she heard something crack before she felt a blinding pain in her wrist. "Broken." He jerked her around, flopping her against the ground again, and her head banged against one of the large rocks strewn about the floor. Gold's vision went blurry. Time stopped. She couldn't move her hands and her feet felt strangely tingly. There was a whooshing sound in her ears and her entire vision narrowed to the monster kneeling over her, claws raised, ready to rip out her throat and feast. She blinked and in a rush, time resumed. She saw the shaft of sunlight behind O'Connell and tried to jerk her hips up and unbalance him into the deadly blaze, but his grip was too strong and he couldn't be moved. She struggled, pushing against him with both hands, ignoring the pain of her broken wrists. They'd ended up near the cave entrance. All she needed to do was make him fall into the sun. But she didn't have the leverage. It seemed to happen in slow motion. He bent over, hands planted on either side of her head. She smelled the putrid stench of his breath and saw the blood and skin caught in his yellowed teeth. Gold rolled her head to the side, trying to see Adam just one last time. He'd shrunk back into the corner, trying to help Lily and keep out of the sun at the same time. Their eyes connected and she felt the bond between them like it was a physical thing, a chain binding their hearts together. "I love you," she said, just before O'Connell's teeth grazed her throat. Before he could fully slake his thirst, his weight was lifted off of her and she heard a crash as two vampires broke through layers of moss and tree roots lining the entrance to the cave. Sun streamed in, the entrance to the cave suddenly twice as large. O'Connell screamed and the smell of burning flesh assailed her nose. "Adam!" Gold yelled and jumped after him into the bed of the ravine. Chapter 20. Gold landed on Adam, arms splayed out, trying to cover every inch of his skin from the weak stream of sunlight that had broken through the tree branches. She could smell the charred ruin of what was left of Richard O'Connell, but the pile of ash and cloth next to Adam didn't look anything like the vampire he'd once been. But Adam wasn't burning. They were frozen for a moment, lying on the damp ground. There was no way that Gold could shield Adam completely. He should have been a pile of ash, but there he was, completely solid, right under her. Gold sat back up and looked down at him. Mouth agape, Adam patted his chest. He couldn't even form a complete sentence, croaking out, "This is," and trailing off. "How?" said Gold. She was afraid that if she stopped touching him he'd dissolve into a puff of smoke and ash. Adam was still amazed. "You're." She spoke at the same time, but neither of them knew how to finish it. Confused, Adam decided. "Human?" she asked. He shook his head and pushed up off the ground, sitting up. "I don't think so." Did that disappoint her? She wasn't sure. He was alive. She was alive. Lily was safe. O'Connell was dead. They'd sort out the particulars later. Gold stood up and offered Adam a hand. He was covered in mud, but made no move to brush it off. Instead, he swept her up, hugging her close and capturing her mouth, kissing her until she couldn't breathe. Gold wrapped her other arm around him but winced when she put any pressure on her broken wrist. Adam immediately pulled back. "Are you hurt?" "It's nothing. We should get you out of this light." "What if?" Gold?" She turned around to see her sister stumbling out of the cave. Lily's hair was a mass of knots, her face covered with dirt. Her shirt was torn and Gold saw a few scratches, but otherwise she seemed unhurt. Dirty and bruised, but okay. Lily's eyes darted between Gold and Adam's arms and the remains of O'Connell. Gold almost stepped back, but Adam tightened his arms around her. "This is my Adam," she said, still unsure of the proper label. Boyfriend felt too small. And she refused to use the term lover, especially around her 15-year-old sister. "Adam, my sister, Lily." They nodded at each other, both unsure of how to treat this situation. Then Lily's eyes widened and she grinned with a glee that only a little sister could muster. "Mom is going to kill you when she finds out you have a vampire boyfriend." Lily was laughing, but it was like a bucket of ice water being dunked over Gold, sweeping away the jubilation of their survival. "Mom. We've got to get back." She clambered up the side of the ravine, helping both Adam and Lily up after her. Then she took off running, knowing they were both only a few paces behind her. They tore through the woods, covering the ground that she and Adam had trekked through in less than half the time. The cave was less than a mile from the house, and now that they were sure of the path, it took less than 10 minutes to make it back. Gold exploded into the backyard and saw blue and red lights flashing in front of the house. She looked back to see Lily outpacing Adam by a few steps. Their eyes met, and the assurance in his gaze was strong enough for her to find the strength in herself to keep moving. She was terrified by what she'd find, but that didn't mean she could ignore it. She also couldn't let Lily go unprepared. She turned around and hugged her sister, her wrist flopping awkwardly. "I'm glad you're okay," she said. "You did good. Really good." Lily clung to her. "What's wrong with Mom?" "She lost a lot of blood. It might be bad, what we see. If you want to go inside and have me take a look first, I'll understand." Since Gold wanted to bury her own head in the sand, she'd never hold it against her sister. "No, I need to see," said Lily. "Okay." Lily had faced down a vampire on her own and made it out, so she was mature enough to make this decision. Gold stepped back and let her lead them around. Adam kept his distance a few paces back, understanding that this was a family moment. His presence kept her standing. When they got to the driveway, what she saw floored her. Her mom was strapped to a stretcher, but she was smiling and her color had improved from deathly pallor to mildly nauseous. She was still in rough shape, but no longer looked like she would die at any moment. Gold and Lily rushed over. Gold grasped her mom's hand with her unbroken one. The paramedics took a step back, giving them a moment. "We did it," said Gold. "He's gone. Lily's safe." Her mom nodded, pain etched in the lines on her face. "Good. What about?" She trailed off and looked over Gold's shoulder. Her smile faded. "He's still here," Gold replied. "They'd have a reckoning about it later." Gold couldn't wait if it meant her mom would survive. One of the paramedics, a blonde woman with a blue baseball cap, came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder lightly. She was so professional that she didn't comment on the fact that 3 injured people had just run out of the woods covered in dirt and blood. "Miss, we need to get going," she said. Then she caught sight of Gold's bruised and rapidly swelling arm. "Wait, what's wrong with your wrist? You should come with us as well. This looks broken." "Go with them," Adam said, standing beside Charlie and Lily. "Get your wrist treated. You stay here," she said before he could insist on coming to the hospital with her. "What if this doesn't last?" He was standing outside and the sun was rapidly rising. The morning was brightening and he needed to get inside. "Watch the kids," she added, though with daylight dawning, they were safe from most threats. Both Charlie and Lily made sounds of protest. But Adam stepped up to her and cupped her cheek, giving her a thorough kiss. "With my life," he promised. With a final wave back to her sister and her cousin, she climbed into the ambulance, and once they loaded up her mom, they were off. Chapter 21. The sun wasn't warm on his skin. He'd spent so many years trying to remember what the sun felt like that he'd forgotten that the chill in the morning air could knock out the yellow warmth. He stood out on the driveway next to Lily and Charlie, who he hadn't actually been introduced to yet. They all stood in silence as the ambulance carried Gold and her mother away. Once it was out of sight, he tilted his head up, letting the light pour over him. Adam didn't understand it. It was at least a half-hour past sunrise and he should have been dead. O'Connell was centuries younger and he'd burned to a crisp in seconds. Light sensitivity only got worse with age. But here he was. "Are you going to catch fire?" Lily asked. Her voice was higher than Gold's and possessed a strain of youthful curiosity and defiance. Was he? Adam turned and studied the 2 children. Lily was the younger one, but the boy, Charlie, couldn't have been much older. They were both eyeing him skeptically. "I'm not sure," he finally answered. "So let's get inside." The kids didn't seem to like the idea. Charlie's jaw had a hard set to it. He'd bring the matches if Adam looked at him the wrong way. Lily was more conflicted. After all, he'd just helped to save her life. The Jones children turned to each other and started to bicker. Adam tuned it out. There were times to eavesdrop and times to let it lie. Rarely was listening to teenagers argue worth his time. It took them a few minutes, but Adam was in no hurry. As the sun rose higher, it started to warm up, the rays of light falling against his skin. He held up his hand, fingers splayed, and waved it in and out of the light, caught between the shadow of the house and the open daylight. "You can come in," Lily finally said to him and led him inside. He didn't tell her that Gold had already issued the invitation. "It's probably safest for you in the basement. There's books and stuff down there." She none too subtly stepped to the side so that he wasn't completely behind her. He'd seen where Gold had gone earlier to fetch Charlie and figured he would be prodded in the same direction. He was. They came to a thick door beside the entrance to the kitchen. Lily opened it and gestured for him to enter. It was dark and he could barely make out the bottom of the stairs, but he saw a string hanging down from the ceiling. A light. If he'd heard 3 weeks ago that he'd willingly enter a vampire hunter's house and let her kid sister lead him to their basement, he would have laughed. And yet, Adam stepped on the first stair and then the second. On the third, he could reach the light. As he pulled on the string, the door slammed shut behind him and a lock slid into place. A moment later he heard something heavy fall against the door. The kid had locked him in. Smart. "Hey, Lily?" he asked, mostly to see if she was willing to talk to him. He could hear her breathing on the other side of the door. "Yeah? If I'd meant you harm, that would have never worked." She heaved a dramatic sigh. "You're a vampire, like I'm going to let you just hang out around my cousin." Her cousin? Was there a connection there? It had been common enough in his day, but Americans seemed to frown on it. But no, he realized. The connection wasn't romantic. Lily was Charlie's protector, despite the fact that she was younger. Charlie had hidden himself away in a panic room while Miss Jones and Lily tried to fight off O'Connell. It was only the women of the Jones family who were the hunters, not the men. Interesting. He left Lily to guard the door, though he was tempted to ram into it a few times to test the strength. But he'd be well behaved. For now. Exhaustion seeped into his bones. The Sunday may not have burned him, but he normally slept now. Adding the excitement of the fight had wrung him dry. Adam found the bathroom and spent a few minutes washing off the dirt and mud from the day before. There was also a laundry room with spare clothes, probably from Charlie. It was only fair for him to take a pair of sweats and a shirt after they'd locked him down here. He found a shabby couch in front of an old TV. He laid down and slept. Hours later, he woke to the sound of footsteps running around above him. He didn't know what time it was, but he didn't think that he'd slept for more than a few hours. The couch was surprisingly comfortable, though there was a slight crick in his neck once he sat up. He considered seeing if the kids would let him out, but decided against it. Gold would come back by nightfall and he could be patient. He only had forever. His first instinct was to worry for her, but he was sure that she was all right. He could feel it. If he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the beeping of hospital equipment and the announcements over the loudspeakers that Gold heard from wherever she sat. He wanted to be there for her, to comfort her as she faced both her mother's injury and her censure. But to do so he'd need to threaten her family. No doubt she would not appreciate that. So he'd wait for one day. And if they didn't let him out then, well, he'd find a way. There wasn't a remote for the television, and when he pressed the buttons to turn it on, nothing happened. Apparently it had been moved to the basement because it was broken. One form of entertainment a bust, he got up and began to look around. Further into the basement there was a small office with impeccably kept shelves. Some of them were glass-fronted to guard against damage from the basement's moisture. There were hundreds of books in the room, maybe thousands. And they ranged from normal histories and novels, books on science and religion, to handwritten journals with covers faded until they were almost impossible to read. He was about to pick up one of the regular books when a journal on the table in the middle of the room fell to the floor. He picked it up and flipped it open. Latin. Really bad Latin, actually. The page he was reading was nearly unintelligible. Whoever had written the text hadn't been educated in Latin. They could probably stumble through a text or two, but when it came to writing, it was a disaster. He was about to close it when his eyes fell on the words nota sanguinum. Blood note or blood mark. The grammar was off, but he caught the meaning. Adam pulled out the chair at the table and sat down. He kept reading. Chapter 22. The Tylenol wasn't doing anything for her wrist, but Gold had refused anything stronger. She hadn't explained where the other cuts came from, but nothing was as serious as the broken wrist, and luckily for her, the hospital was too busy for the doctors to spend too much time on a patient who didn't want more treatment. She'd refused to let them admit her to the hospital, so her wrist was splinted and she was given Tylenol and orders to follow up with her regular doctor if the pain worsened. It had. But Gold could ignore it. If this was the cost of a miracle, she'd gladly take it. Her mom was going to live. Not only that, the injuries had not been nearly as bad as they'd seemed. After a blood transfusion and stitches, she was ready to go home, though under strict orders to remain in bed for the next week. Charlie had come to pick them up from the hospital. He hadn't said anything about Adam and she was afraid to ask. Not with her mom sitting right beside her. Her mom looked over at her and reached for her hand. Gold clasped it. "I want you to be happy, baby," said her mom. Gold smiled, but there was something bittersweet in it. "I know. We'll figure something out." Gold had told her earlier that they'd all survived, including Adam. And she tried not to read into it when her mom looked disappointed at that. But she wasn't going to kill him. She refused. They made it the rest of the way home in silence. Once there, Charlie and Gold helped her mom into her bedroom and Gold got her ready for bed. She placed a bottle of painkillers on the bedside table. "You can have one now," she said, "and one in 8 hours. They're going to make you sleepy." Her mother took the pill and laid down. Gold stayed by her until she fell asleep. The second her mom's breathing evened out, she was out of the room like a shot, looking for Adam. She wasn't surprised that he'd stayed out of her mother's path, but she had expected him to be around somewhere. And then she saw the bar on the basement door. "Lily," she yelled. Her sister remained wisely absent. With her broken wrist, it took a little work to lift the heavy bar from the basement door. Then she unflicked the lock and opened it. The light was on downstairs, and everything looked in the same condition she'd left it in. She walked down the stairs. Adam had ensconced himself in the study. Surrounded by the tomes of her ancestors, he looked like a professor entranced with his work. Seeing him sitting there, healthy, alive, and beautiful as ever, the knot in her chest eased and her shoulders sagged as the tension released. Just looking at him, she couldn't help but smile. "Hey!" He looked up and his grin was identical to her own. "Hey! How is everything?" He reached out a hand for her and she took it, coming around the table and sitting in his lap. Gold hooked an arm around his shoulders and let her fingers play with his hair. At some point he'd found the bathroom in the basement and washed himself off. He smelled like soap and Adam. A perfect combination. She held up her wrist. "I'm broken." He kissed the fingers which were sticking out from the splint. "I'll keep you anyway." He swirled his tongue around the tips of her index finger and Gold's insides curled. But then he pulled back. "And your mom?" "She's good. Better than good." She'd been thinking about it all day. There was no natural way that her mother could have made it. She'd been on death's doorstep. "Did you do something to help her?" It was the only thing she could think of. Adam let out a breath. "I did." He was completely neutral, as if he wasn't sure what her reaction would be. Gold kissed him. "Thank you," she said against his lips. "I love you." Now that she told him, she couldn't stop saying it. His lips followed her and he kissed her back. "I've been thinking of you all day," he whispered. His hand traced against her side, light enough to make her shiver. "I'm sorry Lily locked you down here. I'll talk to her." She was stuck between being proud of her sister's decision and annoyed. "It's okay. I got to catch up on some reading. I found some very interesting stuff." He reached over and grabbed for one of the journals. Gold looked down and her eyes widened. "That one? No one can read it." Every huntress tried, but gave it up when the task of mastering the wretched Latin proved too much. Life was way too short. Many years before there'd been a translation, but it had been lost in a fire more than a century before. Adam, it seemed, already had the required language skills to read it. "The Latin's crap, and my translation is probably not perfect, but I got the gist of it." He brushed his hand gently against the mark on her arm, which was mostly covered by the brace. The marks, they're not a death sentence. Or rather, they don't have to be. What? She and her mother had scoured through half of the huntress diaries in this room. And the answer had been in a text they hadn't even thought to tackle? Adam pulled the notebook forward. It was covered in his neat handwriting. He read his translation. When the blood of the huntress runs within the veins of the demon, and the huntress owns the demon's heart, then he shall be purified. So long as they remain. He took a breath and set the notebook down. Okay, it goes on and on here. Point is, it's binding us together. Yes. He placed her hand on his heart. Souls entwined. And purified? What does that mean? Is that just the sun? Or? I'm still confused. She wanted to snatch this little offering of hope and cling to it forever. At the same time, she wanted an exhaustive dissertation on what exactly this binding meant. He brushed his fingers against her cheek, eyes bright with excitement. I'm still translating. But we have time. So long as we're together, there's time. He kissed her quickly. You own my heart, Gold. And my body and soul. It's yours. Until my dying day and beyond. I'm still a huntress, she whispered, toying with his shirt. I know. He placed his hand over hers. So we'll figure out the rest, right? Yes. He sounded so confident that hope blossomed. I love you. I choose you, even if it means anything. It could mean anything and she'd still choose him. It doesn't. We have our lives, whole, long lives. And we're going to find out what that means. Together. He kissed her again, and when he pulled back, Gold leaned over him and kissed him back. I love you, she said again. I love you, too. He couldn't get enough of saying it either. Gold wrapped her arms tight around him and laid her head down on his shoulder. They were together. They were safe. They were bound. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel for more audiobooks. Did you like this story? I'd love to hear it in the comments.